February 22nd, 2025. Polar bear attacks. Oil workers at Prudhoe Bay, 2 dead, 1 missing. The Arctic wind howled across the frozen wasteland of Prudhoe Bay at 17 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, carrying with it the metallic scent of industrial operations and the ancient untamed wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the oil fields. In the distance, the aurora borealis painted the sky in ethereal greens and purples, a beautiful contradiction to the harsh reality of survival in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The date was February 19th, 2025, 3 days before everything would change forever for Mark Anthony Dawson, Henry James Clark, and Anthony Michael Ross. Mark Dawson stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his weathered face bearing the permanent lines of a man who had spent the better part of his 43 years working in extreme conditions. Born in Fairbanks, Alaska, to a family of pipeline workers, Mark had inherited both his father's work ethic and his grandfather's respect for the untamed Arctic. His calloused hands, scarred from years of handling frozen metal and machinery, moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the equipment manifest for their upcoming 3-day repair mission. Mark's steel blue eyes, which his late wife Sarah used to say could see through a blizzard, scanned the paperwork with meticulous attention to detail. He had been widowed for 2 years now, losing Sarah to cancer at the age of 39, and work had become his only refuge from the emptiness that consumed his small cabin in Fairbanks during his off-rotation periods. Standing beside him in the heated equipment shed, Henry James Clark adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses and double-checked their supply inventory. At 36 years old, Henry was the youngest member of their 3-man crew, but his expertise in pipeline diagnostics and repair had earned him the respect of veterans twice his age. Originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Henry had moved to Alaska 5 years ago, following a bitter divorce that had cost him everything, including custody of his 2 young daughters, Emma and Sophie, aged 8 and 6, respectively. The bitter Minnesota winters had seemed mild compared to his emotional state at the time, but the Arctic had offered him something Minneapolis couldn't, the opportunity to disappear into work so demanding and isolating that there was no room for self-pity or regret. Henry's slight frame, standing 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighing barely 150 pounds, belied his mental toughness and technical expertise. His brown hair, perpetually tousled beneath his work cap, framed a face that still retained traces of boyish optimism despite the hardships that had driven him north. Anthony Michael Ross, known simply as Tony to his colleagues, completed their trio. At 51 years old, Tony was the crew chief and the most experienced Arctic worker among them. Born and raised in Deadhorse, Alaska, the small community that served as the operational hub for the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, Tony had literally grown up with the oil industry. His father, Michael Ross, had been one of the original workers who built the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the 1970s, and Tony had absorbed lessons about Arctic survival from childhood that most people never learned in a lifetime. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall, with the solid, stocky build of a man accustomed to physical labor, Tony's graying beard and weathered features made him look older than his years. His deep-set brown eyes held the wisdom and wariness of someone who had seen the Arctic claim too many lives over the decades. Tony's wife, Margaret, lived in Anchorage with their 3 grown children, Michael Jr., aged 28, Patricia, aged 25, and Robert, aged 23. Tony's dedication to his work came from his desire to provide for his family's future while doing the job he had been born to do. The 3 men had worked together for 18 months, forming the kind of bond that develops only under extreme conditions, where trust literally means the difference between life and death. Their current assignment was a routine maintenance operation on Pipeline Section 7 Delta, located approximately 12 miles southwest of the main Prudhoe Bay facility. The section required replacement of corroded joints and inspection of insulation integrity along a quarter-mile stretch of elevated pipeline. The work was expected to take 3 days, with the crew camping in a temporary shelter near the worksite to minimize travel time and maximize efficiency during the brief daylight hours of the Arctic winter. Their equipment for the mission included a tracked all-terrain vehicle, industrial heating units, arc welding equipment, replacement pipe sections, insulation materials, and enough food and supplies to sustain 3 men for 5 days, allowing for potential weather delays. Communication equipment consisted of satellite radios with redundant backup units, GPS beacons, and emergency locator transmitters. Arctic survival gear included cold weather tents rated for 40 degrees below zero, sleeping bags rated for 60 degrees below zero, emergency shelters, snowshoes, and enough fuel for heating and cooking to last a week under normal conditions. The weather forecast for their mission period predicted typical February conditions, temperatures ranging from -15 to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, with moderate winds of 15 to 25 miles per hour. However, meteorologists at the National Weather Service office in Fairbanks had noted an unusual low-pressure system developing in the Beaufort Sea that could potentially bring more severe conditions to the region by the end of the week. The forecast included a winter storm watch beginning February 22nd, with predictions of heavy snow, wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour, and temperatures plummeting to -40 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. On the morning of February 19th, the 3 men departed the main Prudhoe Bay facility at 0630 hours, just as the first hint of twilight began to touch the eastern horizon. The Arctic winter allowed for only about 4 hours of dim daylight, making efficient use of working hours critical to mission success. Their tracked vehicle, a modified Hägglunds BV206, crawled across the frozen landscape at a steady 8 miles per hour, its twin tracks providing reliable traction across the snow-covered terrain. The journey to Pipeline Section 7 Delta took approximately 90 minutes, during which the men discussed work procedures, shared stories of previous missions, and maintained the casual camaraderie that made the isolation bearable. Mark drove the first leg of the journey, his experienced hands managing the vehicle's controls with automatic precision, while his eyes constantly scanned the landscape ahead. The terrain between the main facility and their worksite consisted of relatively flat tundra, broken by occasional ridges and depressions carved by ancient glacial action. Scattered throughout the area were the industrial artifacts of oil exploration, abandoned drilling platforms, sections of old pipeline, equipment sheds, and access roads that appeared and disappeared under the constantly shifting snow. The landscape held a stark, alien beauty that never failed to impress even the most experienced Arctic workers, but it also conveyed an unmistakable sense of hostility toward human presence. During the drive, Tony shared his knowledge of the local wildlife patterns, information that would prove tragically relevant in the days to come. This time of year, the polar bears are mostly concentrated along the ice edge near the coast, he explained to Henry, who was still relatively new to the region's wildlife hazards. They follow the seals, hunting along the pressure ridges where the sea ice meets the shore. We're far enough inland here that bear encounters are pretty rare, but you never know. The ice conditions this winter have been unusual, with more open water than normal. That sometimes pushes bears further inland looking for food. Henry listened intently, his technical mind absorbing the information with the same focus he applied to pipeline specifications. "What's the protocol if we do encounter a bear?" he asked, adjusting his glasses nervously. "First rule is never run," Tony replied, his voice carrying the authority of hard-earned experience. "Polar bears can run 30 miles per hour across snow, and they don't get tired like we do. If you see a bear, you make yourself as large as possible, make noise, and back away slowly. Most bears will avoid humans if given the opportunity. If a bear approaches, we have bear spray, and there's a 12-gauge shotgun in the equipment kit with slug rounds that can stop anything on 4 legs. Mark nodded in agreement, his eyes still focused on the terrain ahead. I've seen maybe a dozen bears in 20 years of working out here, he added. Most of them were just passing through, more interested in getting to wherever they were going than bothering with us. The key is staying alert and not surprising them. A surprised bear is a dangerous bear. The conversation moved on to other topics as they approached their destination, but Tony's words about unusual ice conditions and bears being pushed inland would echo with terrible prescience in the days to come. None of the 3 men could have imagined that approximately 15 miles to the north, a massive male polar bear weighing nearly 800 pounds was indeed moving inland, driven by hunger and the unusual ice breakup that had destroyed his normal hunting grounds. This bear, a mature male approximately 12 years old, stood nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder and measured over 9 feet from nose to tail. His thick white fur, perfectly adapted for Arctic conditions, concealed a layer of fat and muscle that made him one of the most formidable predators on Earth. His black nose, eyes and claws provided the only contrast to his snow-white camouflage, making him nearly invisible against the Arctic landscape. For 3 days, he had been traveling south from the ice edge, following scent trails and searching for any available food source. The unusual weather patterns had broken up the sea ice earlier than normal, separating him from the seal populations that formed his primary food source. Increasingly desperate and hungry, the bear was entering a state of hyperphagia, the biological condition that drives polar bears to consume any available calories when facing starvation. The bear's acute sense of smell, capable of detecting food sources from miles away, had picked up the human scents and industrial odors emanating from the pipeline work sites. To his primitive but intelligent mind, the smells represented a potential food source in a landscape increasingly devoid of his normal prey. Moving with the patient, methodical approach that had allowed his species to survive in the Arctic for thousands of years, the bear began following these scent trails south, unaware that his path would intersect with that of the 3 oil workers. Pipeline Section 7, Delta occupied a slight elevation in the otherwise flat terrain, providing a view of the surrounding area for several miles in all directions. The pipeline itself stood 8 feet above the ground on metal supports, allowing for thermal expansion and providing protection from permafrost heaving. The elevated design also facilitated maintenance access and prevented snow accumulation from blocking the line during severe weather. The worksite consisted of a quarter-mile section where insulation had deteriorated and several joints showed signs of corrosion requiring replacement. Upon arrival at the site, the 3 men established their temporary camp approximately 100 yards south of the pipeline, positioning their shelter to take advantage of a natural windbreak formed by a low ridge. The shelter itself was a large, insulated tent designed for extreme conditions, equipped with a diesel heating unit that could maintain comfortable interior temperatures even in the harshest Arctic weather. Adjacent to the main shelter, they erected a smaller equipment tent to house their tools, welding equipment and supplies. The first day of work proceeded according to plan. Mark and Tony focused on removing the deteriorated insulation sections, while Henry conducted detailed inspections of the pipe joints, using ultrasonic testing equipment to detect any hidden defects that might cause future failures. The work was physically demanding, requiring the men to climb scaffolding while wearing heavy protective gear and manipulating tools with thick gloves in sub-zero temperatures. Every piece of metal equipment had to be warmed before use to prevent cold-induced brittleness, and the men took frequent breaks in the heated shelter to prevent frostbite and maintain their dexterity. During their lunch break on the first day, Henry noticed tracks in the snow near their camp. "What made these?" he asked. pointing to a series of large, round impressions that led from a depression in the terrain toward the north. Tony examined the tracks carefully, his experienced eyes reading the story they told. "Caribou," he said after a moment. "Probably a small herd moving through yesterday or the day before. The wind and blowing snow have filled them in pretty good, but you can still see the pattern." He pointed to additional tracks leading in the same direction. "They're probably heading toward winter feeding grounds further south." What Tony didn't notice, because the wind and snow had obscured them, were the much larger, more ominous tracks that had followed the caribou trail. The polar bear had been tracking the same herd, hoping for an opportunity to take down a weak or isolated animal. The bear's massive paws, measuring nearly a foot across, left impressions that the casual observer might mistake for caribou tracks, especially when partially filled with blowing snow. Only an expert tracker might have noticed the subtle differences in spacing and depth that indicated a much larger, heavier predator. The first day of work concluded successfully, with the crew removing approximately 1/3 of the deteriorated insulation and preparing the pipe sections for joint replacement. As darkness fell around 1500 hours, the men retired to their shelter for dinner and rest. The temperature had dropped to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind had increased to a steady 20 miles per hour, creating a wind chill factor of negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside their heated shelter. Inside the shelter, the three men shared a meal of freeze-dried beef stew and discussed the next day's work plan. Mark reviewed the technical specifications for the joint replacement procedure, while Tony checked weather updates on their satellite communication device. Henry, ever the methodical engineer, updated his daily work log and calculated their progress against the planned schedule. "Weather's supposed to get worse toward the end of the week," Tony announced, reading from the latest forecast. "They're still calling for a major storm system to move in Friday night, maybe Saturday morning. We should be able to finish the work and get back to base by Friday afternoon if we stay on schedule." Mark looked up from his paperwork. "Any updates on that storm? Last I heard they were calling for 40 to 50 mile per hour winds and heavy snow." "That's still the forecast," Tony replied. "Could be worse, though. The meteorologists aren't real confident about the track of this system. It's been moving slower than they expected, which could mean it'll be stronger when it gets here." Henry adjusted his sleeping bag and settled in for the night. "At least we're ahead of schedule so far. If we can get the joint replacements done tomorrow and finish the insulation work on Thursday, we'll have plenty of time to break camp and get back before the weather hits." The men took turns maintaining watch throughout the night, a standard safety procedure when camping in remote areas. Each man stood a 2-hour watch, monitoring weather conditions, checking the heating system, and maintaining situational awareness of their surroundings. During his watch from 2200 to 0000 hours, Mark stepped outside briefly to check the equipment and noticed that the aurora borealis was particularly active, casting an ethereal green glow across the snow-covered landscape. The beauty of the display was marred only by the increasingly strong wind, which howled across the exposed terrain with a sound that resembled distant screaming. What Mark couldn't see in the darkness, approximately 3 miles to the north, was the massive polar bear that had detected the scent of their camp and was slowly, methodically, making his way toward their location. The bear's exceptional night vision and keen sense of smell guided him across the treacherous terrain as he followed the human scent trail with the patient determination of a predator that had learned to associate human presence with potential food sources. The bear had encountered human settlements twice before in his life, both times during periods of extreme hunger when normal food sources were unavailable. The first encounter, 3 years earlier, had resulted in his successful raid of a research station's garbage dump, providing him with enough calories to survive a particularly harsh winter. The second encounter, just last year, had been less successful, but had reinforced his association between human scents and potential food. Unlike many polar bears that actively avoided human contact, this bear had learned to view humans as both a food source and a competitor for resources in an increasingly challenging environment. As the bear moved through the darkness, his massive frame cast no shadow against the snow, his white fur providing perfect camouflage even in the faint starlight. His broad paws, equipped with curved claws measuring up to 4 inches in length, found secure purchase on the frozen surface as he covered ground with the efficient rolling gait that allowed polar bears to travel vast distances across the Arctic ice. Every few hundred yards, he would pause to test the air, his sensitive nose analyzing the complex mixture of scents carried on the wind, diesel fuel, human perspiration, food odors, and the metallic smell of industrial equipment. The second day of work, February 20th, began before dawn, with the men rising at 0500 hours to prepare for another demanding day of pipeline maintenance. The temperature had dropped to -28 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and frost had accumulated on the inside walls of their shelter despite the continuous operation of the heating unit. Tony started the day by firing up the equipment heaters and allowing the tools to warm to workable temperatures, while Mark prepared breakfast and Henry checked their communication equipment and filed their daily status report with the operations center. "Base, this is Section 7 Delta Repair Crew," Henry spoke into the satellite radio microphone. "Day 2 status report. All personnel healthy and accounted for. Work proceeding on schedule. Current weather conditions. Temperature -28 degrees. Wind 15 to 20 miles per hour from the northwest. Estimated completion remains on schedule for Thursday afternoon. Next scheduled check-in at 1200 hours. Section 7 Delta out." The response from the operations center crackled through the radio speaker with the characteristic delay of satellite communication. "Section 7 Delta, this is base operations. Your status report is received and logged. Be advised that weather conditions are being monitored closely. Current forecast still shows storm system approaching Friday night, with potential for severe conditions. Maintain regular communication schedule and advise immediately of any changes in local conditions. Base out." The morning's work focused on the complex task of replacing corroded pipe joints, a procedure that required precise cutting, fitting and welding under extremely challenging conditions. Each joint replacement involved removing a section of the existing pipeline, carefully measuring and cutting replacement sections, and welding the new joints with equipment that had to be kept warm enough to function properly in the sub-zero temperatures. The men worked in rotation, with one person performing the delicate welding work, while the other two assisted and maintained the heating equipment that kept the work area warm enough for the metal to bond properly. Mark, with his 20-plus years of welding experience, handled the most critical welding tasks, while Tony managed the cutting and fitting operations. Henry, despite his relative newcomer status, proved invaluable in maintaining the heating equipment and ensuring that all specifications and procedures were followed exactly. The work was physically exhausting, requiring the men to maintain precise control while wearing heavy protective gear and working in temperatures that could cause frostbite in minutes if skin was exposed. During their midday break, as the men warmed themselves in the shelter and consumed hot soup and coffee, Tony noticed something that would later prove significant. "There's been some kind of animal around our camp," he observed, pointing through the shelter's window toward a disturbed area in the snow near their equipment tent. "Looks like something was nosing around our gear last night." Mark stepped outside to investigate, his trained eyes examining the area Tony had indicated. The tracks were partially obscured by blowing snow, but he could make out what appeared to be large, circular impressions leading from the equipment tent toward the north. "Probably just a fox or maybe a wolverine checking out our food smells," he concluded, though something about the size and spacing of the tracks bothered him. "We should make sure all our food is sealed up tight. Last thing we need is some scavenger tearing up our supplies. Henry joined them outside, his engineer's mind immediately focusing on the practical implications. Should we move the food supplies inside the main shelter? He asked. Or maybe set up some kind of deterrent around the camp? Tony considered the suggestion while examining the disturbed snow more closely. Something about the tracks seemed familiar, but the wind and blowing snow had distorted them beyond clear identification. Let's move anything that might attract animals inside the shelter, he decided. Better safe than sorry, and we'll keep the perimeter lights on all night. Most animals will avoid bright lights and human activity. What none of the three men realized was that they had just discovered evidence of the polar bear's first reconnaissance of their camp. The massive predator had approached during the early morning hours, using the cover of wind and blowing snow to mask his approach. His keen intelligence had led him to investigate the equipment tent first, where the concentration of human sense was strongest. Finding no immediate food sources, he had retreated to observe from a distance, learning the pattern of human activity and waiting for the right opportunity to approach again. The bear's behavior demonstrated the cunning that had allowed polar bears to become the Arctic's apex predator. Rather than making a direct approach that might alert the humans to his presence, he was conducting a systematic assessment of the situation, identifying potential threats and opportunities. His previous encounters with humans had taught him to be cautious but persistent, and his increasing hunger was overriding his natural wariness. The afternoon's work proceeded without incident, with the crew successfully replacing 2 of the 4 damaged joints and making good progress on the insulation repairs. As darkness began to fall around 1500 hours, the men prepared to conclude the day's work and return to their shelter. The temperature had risen slightly to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind had increased to a steady 25 miles per hour, creating conditions that made outdoor work increasingly difficult. As they secured their equipment and prepared to return to camp, Henry made an observation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "There's something watching us," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. Mark and Tony immediately stopped what they were doing and scanned the surrounding landscape. The fading daylight and blowing snow made visibility limited to perhaps 100 yards in any direction, creating an environment where something large could easily remain hidden just beyond the range of human vision. "Where?" Tony asked, his voice tense with the awareness that comes from years of Arctic experience. In this environment, the feeling of being watched was not something to dismiss lightly. Henry pointed toward a low ridge approximately 200 yards to the north of their position. "I thought I saw something white moving along that ridgeline about 5 minutes ago. It was only for a second, and I might have been mistaken, but it looked too big to be a fox or even a wolf." Mark strained his eyes in the direction Henry indicated, but the combination of failing light and blowing snow made it impossible to distinguish between actual movement and the shifting patterns of wind-blown snow. "Could have been a piece of equipment that blew loose from somewhere," he suggested, though his tone indicated he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. Tony's expression grew more serious as he considered the possibilities. "Could have been a caribou or maybe a muskox," he said, though he knew that both species typically avoided areas with heavy industrial activity. "Whatever it was, we need to stay alert. Let's get back to camp and keep our eyes open." The 3 men packed their equipment with heightened awareness, each of them glancing frequently toward the ridgeline where Henry had spotted the movement. The feeling of being observed persisted as they made their way back to camp, and all 3 men found themselves moving more quickly than usual despite the challenging conditions. Unknown to them, their instincts were absolutely correct. The polar bear had indeed been observing them from the ridgeline, using his superior eyesight and natural camouflage to study their movements and behavior patterns. His primitive but effective intelligence had noted that the humans followed predictable routines. They worked in the same area during daylight hours, returned to the same camp location each evening, and maintained a bright, warm shelter that would make them easy to locate in complete darkness. The bear's hunger had intensified throughout the day, and the scents emanating from the human camp had become increasingly attractive to him. The combination of food odors, human perspiration, and the various chemical smells associated with their equipment created a complex scent profile that his brain had learned to associate with potential caloric intake. As the humans retreated to their shelter for the night, the bear began moving closer, his massive frame moving with surprising stealth across the frozen landscape. That evening, as the three men shared dinner and discussed the next day's work plan, the conversation kept returning to Henry's sighting and the feeling of being watched that all three had experienced. Tony decided to implement additional security measures, including posting a watch throughout the night and keeping the perimeter lights at maximum brightness. "I've been thinking about what Henry saw this afternoon," Tony said as they prepared for sleep. "Even if it was just a caribou or some other animal, we need to be extra careful out here. This is prime polar bear territory, and with the ice conditions being unusual this year, there's always a chance one might wander inland looking for food." Mark nodded in agreement, his expression serious. "I'll take the first watch tonight. We should probably keep the shotgun loaded and accessible just in case." Henry, still shaken by his earlier sighting, volunteered to take the middle watch. "I'll stay alert," he promised. "If there's anything out there, I'll wake you both immediately." As the men settled into their sleeping bags, none of them could have imagined that less than 50 yards from their shelter, a massive polar bear was conducting his own surveillance operation. The bear had approached using a depression in the terrain that allowed him to move within close range without being detected. From this position, he could observe the humans' shelter, study their patterns of activity, and plan his approach. The bear's acute hearing allowed him to monitor the conversation taking place inside the shelter, and his intelligent mind began to correlate the sounds with the behavior patterns he had observed during the day. The regular rhythm of human voices, the mechanical sounds of equipment, and the various odors emanating from the shelter created a comprehensive sensory picture that the bear used to assess both the opportunity and the risk represented by these potential prey animals. Unlike his normal seal prey, which presented relatively straightforward hunting challenges, humans represented a complex mixture of opportunity and danger. The bear's previous encounters had taught him that humans could be a source of food, but they also possessed tools and behaviors that could pose a threat. His approach to hunting humans required the same careful planning and patience that he used when stalking seals along pressure ridges in the sea ice. As the night progressed and the humans settled into their sleep routine, the bear began a systematic exploration of their camp perimeter. Moving with the silent efficiency that made polar bears such effective predators, he investigated each piece of equipment, memorized the layout of the camp, and identified potential approach routes that would allow him to attack with maximum surprise and effectiveness. The first watch passed without incident, with Mark observing nothing more threatening than the continued aurora borealis display and the steady howling of the Arctic wind. During Henry's watch, from midnight to 200 hours, he reported seeing what might have been movement in the darkness beyond the perimeter lights. But the combination of blowing snow and shifting light patterns made it impossible to determine whether the movement was real or imagined. Tony's watch, from 200 to 400 hours, proved more eventful. At approximately 0245 hours, he detected a sound that didn't match the normal pattern of wind and equipment noise, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere just beyond the circle of light surrounding their camp. Tony immediately grabbed the shotgun and stepped outside the shelter, his senses hyper-alert as he scanned the darkness for any sign of threat. "Mark! Henry!" he called quietly into the shelter. "We've got company." Both men immediately awakened and joined Tony outside, their own senses straining to detect whatever had alarmed their crew chief. For several minutes they stood in the bitter cold, listening and watching, but heard only the wind and the distant sounds of industrial equipment from other work sites miles away. "What did you hear?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Sounded like a growl," Tony replied, his eyes continuing to scan the darkness. "Could have been the wind playing tricks, but it didn't sound like any natural sound I've heard before." Henry's heart raced as he remembered his earlier sighting of something watching them from the ridgeline. "Maybe we should call base and request an early pickup," he suggested. "If there's a bear in the area, we might be better off finishing this job with additional backup." Tony considered the suggestion, but ultimately decided against it. "Let's wait until morning before making that call," he said. "If we see any definite signs of bear activity, we'll call for immediate extraction. But for now, we'll maintain watch and stay alert." What Tony didn't know was that his instincts had been absolutely correct. The polar bear had indeed approached within 20 yards of their shelter, and the growl he had heard was the bear's natural vocalization as he assessed the humans and their potential as prey. The bear's approach had been detected only because of Tony's experience and heightened alertness. A less experienced person might have dismissed the sound as wind or equipment noise. The bear's proximity to the camp represented a critical escalation in the developing situation. Having completed his reconnaissance and confirmed the presence of 3 humans, the bear was now in the final phase of his hunting sequence. His hunger and the sense emanating from the camp had overcome his natural caution, and he was preparing to make his move. The remainder of the night passed, with all 3 men maintaining heightened alertness, taking turns on watch and keeping the shotgun readily accessible. None of them slept deeply, and by morning they were all exhausted and on edge from the constant tension of wondering what might be lurking in the darkness beyond their camp. Dawn on February 21st brought no relief from the sense of foreboding that had settled over the camp. As the men prepared for their 3rd day of work, they discovered unmistakable evidence that their fears had been justified. Large tracks, clearly visible in the fresh snow that had fallen during the night, circled their camp at a distance of approximately 30 to 40 yards. The tracks were unlike anything Henry had ever seen, measuring nearly 12 inches across and showing the distinctive claw marks and pad impressions of a massive predator. "Those are polar bear tracks," Tony announced grimly, his years of Arctic experience allowing him to identify the species immediately. "And they're fresh. This bear was here during the night, probably while we were on watch." Mark examined the tracks more closely, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he followed the trail around their camp perimeter. "This is a big one," he observed. "Look at the spacing between the tracks and the depth of the impressions. We're talking about an animal that probably weighs 700 or 800 pounds. Henry felt his stomach clench with fear as he realized how close they had come to a potentially fatal encounter. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice betraying his nervousness. Tony's mind raced through their options, weighing the risks and benefits of each possible course of action. "First, we call base and report the situation," he decided. "They need to know we have a bear in the area, and we need to get guidance on whether to continue the work or request immediate extraction." The satellite radio crackled to life as Tony made the call that would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately prove inadequate to prevent the tragedy that was now inevitable. "Base. This is Section 7 Delta Repair Crew. We have a situation here that requires immediate consultation." The response came back after the standard satellite delay. "Section 7 Delta, this is base operations. What is the nature of your situation?" We have confirmed polar bear activity around our camp, Tony reported. Fresh tracks indicate a large bear circled our perimeter during the night, requesting guidance on whether to continue operations or abort mission. There was a longer delay before the response came back, indicating that the operations center was consulting with supervisors and possibly wildlife authorities. Section 7, Delta, maintain your current position and stand by for instructions. We are consulting with wildlife management and will advise you of recommended procedures. Do not attempt to continue work operations until you receive further instructions. While they waited for instructions from base, the three men conducted a more thorough examination of the bear tracks and the surrounding area. What they discovered was deeply disturbing. The tracks indicated that the bear had made multiple approaches to their camp during the night, each time coming closer than the previous approach. The pattern suggested an animal that was systematically studying their defenses and looking for the best opportunity to attack. This bear isn't just passing through, Mark observed, his voice tight with concern. Look at these tracks. He made at least 4 different approaches, each one from a different direction. He's hunting us. Tony's expression grew grim as he followed the track patterns and realized that Mark's assessment was correct. A bear that's actively hunting humans is extremely dangerous, he said. Most bears avoid human contact, but when they start viewing people as prey, they become persistent and increasingly bold. Henry's engineering mind sought practical solutions to their predicament. What about the vehicle? He asked. Could we pack up our equipment and get back to base immediately? That's probably our best option, Tony agreed. But we need to wait for clearance from base before we move. They may want to send a helicopter or additional personnel to help us evacuate safely. The radio crackled again with the long-awaited instructions. Section 7 Delta, this is base operations with your instructions. Wildlife management advises that polar bear encounters require extreme caution. You are authorized to abort current mission and return to base immediately. Pack essential equipment only and maintain radio contact during your return journey. A helicopter will be dispatched to provide aerial reconnaissance and support during your evacuation. The relief in all 3 men was palpable as they received authorization to abandon their mission and return to safety. However, their relief was tempered by the realization that they would have to pack their equipment and travel across 12 miles of open terrain while being stalked by one of the world's most dangerous predators. How long will it take to pack the essential equipment? Tony asked, already beginning to mentally prioritize which items were absolutely necessary and which could be abandoned. Mark was already moving toward the equipment tent. If we just take the critical tools and leave the bulk supplies, we could be ready to move in an hour, he estimated. The welding equipment and the heavy insulation materials can be recovered later. Henry began shutting down the heating systems and preparing their personal gear for transport. What about the shelter and the camp equipment? He asked. Leave it, Tony decided. The company can send a crew back later to recover anything that's worth salvaging. Our priority is getting out of here alive. As the 3 men worked to pack their essential equipment, they were acutely aware that they were being watched. The polar bear had withdrawn to a safe distance when the humans increased their activity level, but he remained in the area, observing their preparations and waiting for an opportunity to strike. His hunting instincts told him that the humans were preparing to leave, and his experience had taught him that moving prey was often more vulnerable than stationary prey. The bear's position on a low ridge, approximately 400 yards north of the camp, provided him with an excellent vantage point to observe the humans' activities. His white fur made him virtually invisible against the snow-covered landscape, and his patience was unlimited. Unlike human hunters who might grow restless or abandon a hunt due to time constraints, the polar bear was prepared to wait as long as necessary for the right opportunity. The packing process took longer than anticipated, partly because the men were working with heightened caution, and partly because the extreme cold made every task more difficult. Tools that had been warming in heated storage became almost too cold to handle within minutes of being exposed to the outside air. The men had to work in short bursts, frequently returning to the shelter to warm their hands and prevent frostbite. During one of these warming breaks, Henry made an observation that added another layer of concern to their situation. "The weather's getting worse," he pointed out, indicating the increasingly heavy snowfall and strengthening wind. "Visibility is dropping, and if this keeps up, it could affect the helicopter's ability to provide support." Tony checked the latest weather update on their satellite radio and confirmed Henry's fears. "The storm system is moving in faster than predicted," he reported. "Current forecast shows blizzard conditions possible by early afternoon, with winds up to 40 miles per hour and heavy snow reducing visibility to near zero." Mark looked up from the equipment he was packing. "How does that affect our evacuation plan?" he asked. "Helicopter support may not be possible if conditions deteriorate," Tony admitted. "We may have to make the trip back to base on our own, without air support." The implications of this development were sobering for all three men. Traveling across 12 miles of open Arctic terrain during a blizzard while being stalked by a polar bear represented a survival challenge that would test all of their skills and experience. The tracked vehicle would provide some protection from the weather and the bear, but mechanical failures in extreme conditions were always a possibility, and the bear's persistence suggested that he would follow them regardless of their method of travel. By 10:30 hours, the men had packed their essential equipment and were ready to begin their evacuation. The weather had continued to deteriorate, with heavy snow reducing visibility to less than a quarter mile, and wind gusts reaching 30 miles per hour. The temperature had dropped to negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill factor was approaching negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. "Base, this is Section 7 Delta," Tony reported via radio. "We are packed and ready to begin evacuation. Current weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Visibility less than quarter mile and dropping. Request status on helicopter support." The response from base was not encouraging. "Section 7 Delta. Helicopter support has been cancelled due to weather conditions. You are cleared to begin ground evacuation immediately. Maintain radio contact and report your position every 30 minutes. Emergency rescue teams are on standby if needed." Tony looked at his two companions, seeing his own concerns reflected in their faces. "Well, gentlemen," he said with forced calm, "it looks like we're doing this the hard way. Everyone double-check your survival gear and make sure your emergency locators are activated." The men conducted final equipment checks, ensuring that their personal locator beacons were functioning. Their cold weather gear was properly secured, and their emergency supplies were easily accessible. The shotgun was loaded with slug rounds and secured in the vehicle where it could be quickly accessed if needed. Additional ammunition, bear spray, emergency food, and medical supplies were distributed among the three men to ensure redundancy in case they became separated. At 1100 hours, the three men climbed into their tracked vehicle and began what they hoped would be their final journey across the frozen landscape of Prudhoe Bay. Mark took the driver's position, his experience with Arctic vehicle operation making him the natural choice to navigate through the increasingly challenging conditions. Tony occupied the passenger seat, where he could monitor radio communications and watch for potential hazards. Henry secured himself in the rear compartment with the equipment and supplies, maintaining watch through the rear windows for any sign of pursuit. The vehicle's diesel engine struggled to maintain operating temperature in the extreme cold, requiring frequent use of the auxiliary heating system to prevent fuel gelling and mechanical failure. The tracked drive system provided reliable traction on the snow-covered terrain, but the increasing wind made steering difficult and reduced their maximum safe speed to approximately 5 miles per hour. During the first hour of travel, the men maintained radio contact with base every 15 minutes, reporting their position and current conditions. The weather continued to deteriorate, with visibility dropping to less than 100 yards and wind gusts strong enough to rock their heavy vehicle. Despite the challenging conditions, they were making steady progress toward base, covering approximately 4 miles during the first hour. It was during the second hour of travel, at approximately 12-15 hours, that Henry spotted their stalker. "There's something following us," he reported, his voice tight with tension as he strained to see through the rear windows. "About 200 yards behind us, matching our speed." Tony immediately grabbed the shotgun and moved to the rear of the vehicle to confirm Henry's sighting. Through the swirling snow and limited visibility, he could make out a large white shape moving parallel to their course. The shape was too large to be anything other than the polar bear, and its persistent presence confirmed their worst fears about the animal's intentions. "It's definitely our friend from last night," Tony confirmed grimly. "He's following us, probably waiting for us to stop or break down." Mark's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel more tightly. "Can we outrun him?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not in these conditions," Tony replied. "The snow and wind are limiting our speed, and polar bears can maintain their top speed longer than we can push this vehicle. Our best bet is to keep moving and hope we can reach base before he decides to make his move." The knowledge that they were being actively hunted by one of nature's most efficient predators added a new dimension of stress to their already challenging evacuation. Every sound from the vehicle's engine, every vibration from the tracks, and every gust of wind that rocked their protection became a potential signal that their situation was deteriorating toward a life-or-death confrontation. Henry continued to monitor their pursuer through the rear windows, reporting on the bear's position and behavior. "He's staying about the same distance behind us," he observed. "Sometimes I lose sight of him in the snow, but he always reappears. It's like he knows exactly where we're going." Tony's expression grew increasingly grim as he considered the implications of the bear's behavior. "Polar bears are intelligent hunters," he explained. "If this one has encountered humans before, he may have learned to associate our vehicles and travel patterns with potential food sources. He's probably following us because he expects us to stop eventually." Mark focused on maintaining their course while dealing with the increasingly difficult driving conditions. The wind was now gusting up to 40 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. Navigation was becoming increasingly difficult, with familiar landmarks obscured by blowing snow and the GPS system struggling to maintain accuracy in the extreme conditions. At 12:45 hours, their worst fears were realized when Mark felt the vehicle's engine begin to lose power. "We're having engine trouble," he announced, his voice betraying his growing panic. "Temperatures dropping and the power output is falling off." Tony immediately moved to the engine compartment to assess the situation while Henry continued to monitor their pursuer. The diagnostic indicators showed that fuel gelling was beginning to occur despite the heated fuel lines, and ice was accumulating in the air intake system. Both problems were common in extreme Arctic conditions, but potentially catastrophic when facing a survival situation. "How bad is it?" Henry asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. Mark's hands worked frantically over the controls as he tried to maintain engine function. "Bad," he admitted. "We're losing power, and the heating system is struggling to keep up. If the engine stops, we'll be stranded." Tony's mind raced through their options as he worked to clear ice from the air intake system. "Base, this is Section 7 Delta," he radioed. "We are experiencing mechanical difficulties with our vehicle. Current position approximately 8 miles southwest of base. Engine problems may force us to stop." The response from base was immediate. "Section 7 Delta, understood. Emergency rescue teams are being dispatched. Maintain radio contact and prepare for possible overnight survival conditions." The reality of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. They were 8 miles from safety, being stalked by a polar bear, facing mechanical failure of their primary transportation, and trapped in a blizzard that was making rescue operations extremely difficult. The combination of factors created a survival scenario that would challenge even the most experienced Arctic veterans. Henry's voice cut through the wind noise with an urgency that made both men's blood run cold. "The bear's getting closer. He's maybe 100 yards behind us now, and he's moving faster." Tony grabbed the shotgun and checked to ensure it was fully loaded, while Mark continued his desperate efforts to keep the engine running. The vehicle was now moving at barely 3 miles per hour, and the engine temperature was continuing to drop, despite the auxiliary heating system's operation at maximum output. "There!" Henry shouted, pointing through the rear window. "I can see him clearly now. He's huge!" Through the swirling snow, the massive polar bear became visible as more than just a white shape in the distance. His enormous size was evident even through the limited visibility, and his purposeful, determined gait left no doubt about his intentions. The bear had closed the distance to less than 50 yards and was now moving at a steady lope that would bring him alongside their vehicle within minutes. Mark made a desperate decision that would ultimately prove fatal. "I'm going to try to get more power from the engine," he announced, reaching for the emergency throttle override that could provide additional power, but at the risk of catastrophic engine failure. The engine responded to the override with a surge of power that allowed their speed to increase to nearly 8 miles per hour, but the additional strain on the cold-damaged systems triggered a cascade of mechanical failures that Mark's 20 years of experience couldn't prevent. Within 30 seconds of engaging the override, the engine seized completely, leaving them stranded in the middle of the frozen wasteland with a hungry polar bear closing in rapidly. "Engine's dead," Mark announced, with the calm that comes from accepting an inevitable disaster. "We're on foot from here." Tony's mind immediately shifted to survival mode as he assessed their remaining options. "Emergency gear," he ordered. "Everyone take emergency food, shelter materials and signaling devices. Henry, you carry the radio. Mark, take the medical kit. I'll carry the shotgun and ammunition." The 3 men began the frantic process of abandoning their disabled vehicle and preparing to continue their evacuation on foot through the blizzard. The outside temperature was now negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was creating a wind chill factor of negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposure time before frostbite would be measured in minutes, and their survival depended on reaching shelter or rescue before hypothermia set in. As they prepared to exit the vehicle, Henry made one final observation that sent chills through all 3 men. The bear's stopped. He's just sitting there watching us. Less than 30 yards away, the massive polar bear had indeed stopped and was observing their preparations with the patient intelligence that made his species such effective predators. His black eyes, the only visible contrast to his white fur, tracked their movements with calculating precision. Years of hunting experience had taught him that prey animals were most vulnerable when they were distressed and making rapid movements. The bear's stillness was not passivity, but preparation, the calm before the explosive burst of speed and power that would characterize his attack. "He's waiting for us to come out," Tony observed, his voice grim with the realization that they were about to face a predator that had chosen the time and place for their confrontation. "Once we leave the vehicle, we'll be completely exposed." Mark checked his watch and calculated the remaining daylight. "We have maybe 3 hours of limited daylight left," he reported. "If we're going to make it to base on foot, we need to start moving now." Henry activated their emergency locator beacon and made what would prove to be their final radio transmission. "Base, this is Section 7 Delta. Vehicle disabled approximately 8 miles southwest of base. Beginning evacuation on foot. Polar bear in immediate vicinity. Emergency locators activated." The response from base was immediate, but would prove inadequate. "Section 7 Delta, emergency rescue operations are being hampered by weather conditions. Maintain shelter if possible and await rescue. Ground teams are en route, but ETA is unknown due to conditions." Tony made the decision that would seal their fate. "We can't wait for rescue. The bear isn't going to leave, and we don't have enough fuel to keep the heater running overnight. We have to try to reach base on foot." At 13:30 hours on February 21st, 2025, 3 men opened the doors of their disabled vehicle and stepped into the Arctic blizzard that would become the last landscape 2 of them would ever see. The polar bear immediately rose to his feet and began moving toward them with the purposeful stride that preceded his attack. Mark Dawson, Henry Clark, and Anthony Ross began walking toward what they hoped was safety, unaware that they had just initiated the final phase of a hunt that had been developing for 3 days. The men attempted to maintain a defensive formation as they walked, with Tony carrying the shotgun and maintaining watch behind them, while Mark and Henry shared the navigation duties and carried the emergency equipment. The deep snow made walking exhausting, and the extreme cold began affecting their coordination and judgment within minutes of leaving their vehicle. The polar bear followed at a distance of approximately 20 yards, matching their pace and clearly waiting for one of them to show signs of weakness or become separated from the group. His hunting instincts told him that exhausted, cold-stressed prey would eventually make mistakes that would provide him with opportunities to attack. The bear's patience was infinite, and his energy reserves far exceeded those of the humans he was stalking. For the first hour of their march, the 3 men managed to maintain their formation and make steady progress toward base. The GPS device showed that they had covered approximately 2 miles, leaving them with about 6 miles still to travel. However, the extreme conditions were taking their toll on all 3 men, with Mark beginning to show signs of frostbite on his exposed facial features and Henry struggling with the physical demands of walking through deep snow while carrying heavy equipment. It was during the 2nd hour of their march that the situation began to deteriorate rapidly. Henry, exhausted from the physical demands of the march and stressed by the knowledge that they were being hunted, began to fall behind the pace set by Mark and Tony. The gap between Henry and his companions gradually widened, despite their efforts to maintain group cohesion. "I need to rest," Henry called out, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I can't keep up this pace." Tony immediately recognized the danger of allowing their group to become separated. "We stop together or not at all," he replied, dropping back to assist Henry. "The bear is looking for exactly this kind of opportunity." Mark also turned back to help his struggling colleague, but their momentary pause and the slight confusion in their formation created the opening that the polar bear had been waiting for. With explosive speed that belied his massive size, the bear launched himself forward, covering the 20 yards between him and his prey in less than 3 seconds. Tony barely had time to raise the shotgun before 800 pounds of apex predator slammed into Mark Dawson with the force of a freight train. The impact lifted Mark completely off his feet and drove him backward into the snow with such violence that the sound could be heard above the wind. The bear's massive jaws clamped down on Mark's torso with crushing force, and his 4-inch claws raked through the heavy Arctic clothing as if it were tissue paper. "Mark!" Henry screamed, paralyzed by the sudden explosion of violence and the realization that his colleague was being killed in front of him. Tony, his hands numb from the cold, struggled to aim the shotgun as the bear's attack continued with savage intensity. The weapon's safety mechanism, designed to prevent accidental discharge, had become difficult to operate with frozen fingers, and the few precious seconds required to prepare the weapon allowed the bear to complete his initial kill. Mark's death was not instantaneous, but was mercifully brief. The polar bear's initial bite had caused massive internal injuries, and his powerful claws had severed major arteries. Within 15 seconds of the attack's beginning, Mark Dawson was unconscious and bleeding to death in the Arctic snow, while his killer looked up to assess the remaining threats. Tony finally managed to fire the shotgun, the 12-gauge slug striking the bear in the shoulder and causing him to release Mark's body and rear up on his hind legs with a roar of pain and rage. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal, serving primarily to enrage the already aggressive predator and focus his attention on the remaining humans. Henry, overcome by panic and the trauma of witnessing his colleague's death, made the fatal mistake that Tony had warned against. He ran. Despite the deep snow and his heavy equipment, Henry's terror provided him with a burst of adrenaline-fueled energy that allowed him to outdistance Tony and put significant distance between himself and the site of the attack. Tony, faced with an enraged and wounded polar bear and the need to protect his fleeing colleague, made the decision to stand his ground and continue fighting. He worked the shotgun's action to chamber another round, but the extreme cold had affected the weapon's mechanical operation, and the action jammed as he attempted to reload. The wounded polar bear, his hunting instincts fully aroused by the taste of blood and the pain from his gunshot wound, charged Tony with even greater ferocity than he had shown in his attack on Mark. Tony attempted to use the shotgun as a club, but the bear's speed and power made resistance futile. Within seconds, Tony Ross joined Mark Dawson in the Arctic snow, his body broken by the bear's claws and teeth. Henry, meanwhile, had managed to put nearly 100 yards between himself and the attack site before the combination of deep snow, extreme cold, and sheer exhaustion forced him to stop. As he struggled to catch his breath and assess his situation, he could hear the sounds of the bear's continued assault on Tony echoing across the frozen landscape. The realization that both of his colleagues were dead and that he was now alone in the Arctic blizzard with a wounded and enraged polar bear filled him with a despair that nearly paralyzed him completely. The emergency radio, which Henry had been carrying, had been damaged during his panicked flight and was no longer functional. His GPS device showed his position as approximately 6.5 miles from base, but the blizzard conditions made navigation extremely difficult. Most critically, his emergency locator beacon had been damaged when he fell during his escape, leaving him without any way to signal for help. Behind him, the polar bear had finished his attacks on Mark and Tony and was now feeding, his massive appetite finally being satisfied after days of hunger. The bear's feeding behavior provided Henry with a temporary reprieve, but his situation remained desperate. He was alone in Arctic conditions that could kill him within hours. Without functional communication equipment and being stalked by a predator that would soon resume hunting once his immediate hunger was satisfied, Henry's survival instincts, shaped by 5 years of Arctic experience, told him that his only chance was to continue moving toward base and hope that rescue teams could locate him before hypothermia or the polar bear ended his life. He began walking again, using the GPS device to maintain his heading while conserving his energy and trying to preserve body heat in the extreme conditions. The blizzard was now at full intensity, with winds gusting up to 50 miles per hour and snow falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to less than 10 yards. The temperature had dropped to negative 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill factor was approaching negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Under these conditions, exposed skin would freeze in less than 2 minutes, and even with the best Arctic survival gear, hypothermia was inevitable without shelter or rescue. Henry's march toward base became a race against time and the elements. Every step required enormous effort in the deep snow, and the extreme cold was rapidly sapping his strength and affecting his mental clarity. After 30 minutes of walking, he began to experience the early stages of hypothermia, confusion, clumsiness, and the dangerous feeling of warmth that indicated his body's core temperature was dropping to critical levels. Behind him, the polar bear had finished feeding and was now following Henry's trail through the snow. The bear's wound, while serious, had not significantly impaired his mobility, and his recent feeding had provided him with the energy needed to continue his hunt. The bear's tracking abilities, enhanced by his exceptional sense of smell, allowed him to follow Henry's scent trail even in the blizzard conditions. At approximately 1500 hours, Henry made a critical error in navigation that sealed his fate. The combination of hypothermia-induced confusion and the whiteout conditions caused him to veer off course, leading him away from base and toward a series of low ridges that would provide shelter from the wind, but would also trap him in a dead-end terrain feature where rescue would be impossible. Henry realized his mistake when he found himself in a narrow valley between two ridges. But by then, his hypothermia was too advanced for him to make rational decisions about correcting his course. Instead of retracing his steps, he decided to seek shelter among the rocks at the head of the valley, hoping that the wind protection would allow him to survive until rescue arrived. The polar bear, following Henry's trail, found him approximately 30 minutes later. Henry, semi-conscious from hypothermia and huddled in what little shelter the rocks provided, was unable to offer any resistance when the bear approached. Unlike his violent attacks on Mark and Tony, the bear's final kill was almost gentle, more like a large cat dispatching wounded prey than the explosive violence that had characterized the earlier attacks. Henry Clark's death occurred at approximately 15:45 hours on February 21, 2025, in a small valley approximately 7 miles southwest of the Prudhoe Bay base facility. His body was never recovered, as the blizzard covered the site with several feet of new snow, and the polar bear, satisfied with his successful hunt, dragged the remains further into the wilderness before abandoning them to scavengers. The rescue operation that was launched in response to the crew's final radio transmission was hampered from the beginning by the severe weather conditions. Ground teams using tracked vehicles and snowmobiles were unable to make significant progress through the blizzard, and helicopter operations were impossible due to the wind and reduced visibility. The search teams were forced to wait until the storm passed before beginning their efforts to locate the missing men. On February 23rd, as the weather finally began to clear, aerial reconnaissance located the disabled tracked vehicle and the remains of Mark Dawson and Tony Ross. The scene told a clear story of the polar bear attack, with blood evidence, tracks, and scattered equipment providing investigators with a detailed picture of what had occurred. However, no trace of Henry Clark was found at the attack site, leading to an extensive search operation that would continue for 5 days. The search for Henry involved multiple aircraft, ground teams, and specialized Arctic rescue personnel. The area was systematically searched using helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and ground teams on snowmobiles and tracked vehicles. Search dogs were brought in to follow scent trails, and thermal imaging equipment was used to scan for any signs of human presence. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Henry or his equipment was ever found. The polar bear responsible for the attacks was located and killed by wildlife authorities on February 25th, approximately 15 miles north of the attack site. Examination of the bear's stomach contents confirmed that he had fed on all 3 victims, and the gunshot wound to his shoulder matched the ballistics evidence from Tony's shotgun. The bear was determined to be a mature male weighing 780 pounds, in poor physical condition due to lack of food, and showing signs of previous encounters with humans, including old scars that suggested encounters with vehicles or equipment. The official investigation into the incident was conducted jointly by Alaska State Troopers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the oil company's Internal Safety Division. The investigation concluded that the attack was the result of a combination of factors: unusual ice conditions that had pushed polar bears inland in search of food, the bears' previous conditioning to associate humans with food sources, and the crew's mechanical failure that left them exposed during the worst possible weather conditions. The investigation's findings led to significant changes in Arctic work procedures, including mandatory bear deterrent equipment for all remote work crews, improved communication protocols, and enhanced emergency response capabilities. However, these changes came too late for Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark, who became statistics in the long history of human encounters with one of nature's most formidable predators. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a trauma psychologist who specializes in wilderness survival incidents, was brought in to counsel the families and colleagues of the 3 victims. In her analysis of the incident, she noted that the psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate families to include the entire Arctic work community. The deaths of Mark, Tony, and Henry represent every Arctic worker's worst nightmare, Dr. Mitchell explained in her report. These were experienced professionals who followed proper procedures and took appropriate precautions, yet they still fell victim to circumstances beyond their control. The randomness and violence of their deaths creates a form of survivor's guilt among their colleagues that can be extremely difficult to process. Margaret Ross, Tony's widow, struggled to comprehend the loss of her husband of 28 years. "Tony knew the Arctic better than anyone," she said during an interview 3 months after the incident. "He taught safety courses, he trained new workers, he was the person everyone went to for advice about polar bear encounters. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone." The Ross family's grief was complicated by the nature of Tony's death and the knowledge that he had died trying to protect his younger colleague. Their son, Michael Jr., who had followed his father into Arctic work, found it particularly difficult to return to his job after the incident. "Every time I see tracks in the snow or hear an unusual sound, I think about what Dad went through," Michael Jr. admitted during a counseling session. "He taught me to respect the Arctic and the wildlife, but he also taught me that if you're careful and prepared, you can work safely up there." This incident shattered that belief. Mark Dawson's death was particularly tragic because he had been planning to retire at the end of the year and move to Arizona to be near his late wife's sister and her family. Mark's funeral was attended by over 200 people, including colleagues from across the Arctic oil industry who traveled from Alaska, Canada, and Norway to pay their respects. "Mark was the kind of person you could depend on completely," said his supervisor Jim Patterson during the eulogy. "He never took shortcuts, he never compromised on safety, and he never left a job unfinished. The fact that he died doing the work he loved doesn't make his loss any easier to bear." The mystery surrounding Henry Clark's disappearance added an additional layer of trauma for his family and friends. His ex-wife, Jennifer, brought their daughters Emma and Sophie to Alaska for the memorial service, hoping for some form of closure that never came. "The girls keep asking when Daddy's coming home," Jennifer said tearfully. "How do you explain to an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old that their father is probably dead, but that we might never know for certain? Henry made mistakes in our marriage, but he was trying to build a better life for himself and for the girls. He didn't deserve to die alone in that frozen wilderness." The extensive search for Henry's remains continued sporadically for over a year, with volunteers and professional search teams making periodic attempts to locate any trace of him or his equipment. The harsh Arctic conditions, the vast search area, and the likelihood that wildlife had scattered his remains made the chances of recovery extremely remote. Detective Lieutenant Patricia Kowalski of the Alaska State Troopers, who led the investigation, provided a detailed analysis of the factors that contributed to the tragedy. This incident represents a perfect storm of circumstances that overwhelmed even experienced Arctic workers, she explained in her final report. The unusual weather patterns pushed a hungry bear into human territory. Mechanical failure stranded the victims in the worst possible location, and communication difficulties prevented timely rescue operations. Lieutenant Kowalski's investigation revealed that the polar bear had likely been in the area for several days before the attack, possibly following the scent trails left by previous work crews. Radiotelemetry data from other bears in the region showed unusual movement patterns during the same time period, suggesting that the ice breakup had displaced multiple bears from their normal hunting grounds. The bear that killed these men was not behaving abnormally, Lieutenant Kowalski noted. He was responding to environmental pressures and following his instincts for survival. The tragedy is that his survival instincts ultimately conflicted with human activities in a way that proved fatal for both species. The mechanical failure of the crew's vehicle was attributed to the extreme weather conditions and the age of the equipment. Investigation revealed that the vehicle had been operating at the limits of its design parameters, and while it had been properly maintained, the combination of extreme cold and extended operation had caused multiple system failures that were difficult to predict or prevent. These vehicles are designed to operate in harsh conditions, but they're not infallible, explained mechanical engineer David Rodriguez, who analyzed the failed equipment. The fuel gelling, ice accumulation, and thermal stress that caused the breakdown were all predictable responses to the conditions, but the timing was catastrophically unlucky. The oil company's response to the incident included a comprehensive review of all Arctic safety procedures and a significant investment in improved equipment and training. New vehicles with enhanced cold weather capabilities were purchased, communication systems were upgraded, and mandatory polar bear awareness training was instituted for all personnel working in remote locations. Company spokesman Robert Hutchins addressed the changes in a press conference held 6 months after the incident. The deaths of Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark represent an unacceptable loss of life that we are committed to preventing in the future. While we cannot eliminate all risks associated with Arctic operations, we can and will do everything possible to minimize those risks and protect our employees. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against the oil company, alleging that inadequate safety procedures and equipment failures contributed to the tragedy. The lawsuits were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, with the company admitting no wrongdoing, but agreeing to implement additional safety measures and provide long-term financial support for the victims' families. Dr. James Morrison, a wildlife biologist who has studied polar bear behavior for over 20 years, provided scientific context for the incident in a report published in the Journal of Arctic Wildlife Management. Polar bear attacks on humans are extremely rare, but they are becoming more frequent as climate change and industrial activity alter the Arctic ecosystem, Dr. Morrison explained. The bear involved in this incident was displaying typical predatory behavior under stress conditions caused by loss of normal food sources. Dr. Morrison's research indicated that the warming Arctic climate was creating more frequent conflicts between polar bears and human activities. As sea ice becomes less reliable and traditional food sources become harder to access, polar bears are being forced to adapt their behavior and explore new food sources, he noted. Unfortunately, this sometimes brings them into contact with humans in situations that can prove fatal for both species. The incident also prompted discussions about the ethics and sustainability of industrial operations in sensitive Arctic ecosystems. Environmental groups used the tragedy to highlight their concerns about oil exploration in polar bear habitat, while industry representatives argued that such incidents were rare anomalies that should not prevent necessary economic development. Dr. Rebecca Armstrong, an environmental ethicist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, provided a thoughtful analysis of the competing interests involved. The deaths of these three men represent a tragic intersection of human economic activity and wildlife conservation needs. We must ask ourselves whether the benefits of Arctic oil extraction justify the risks to both human workers and the wildlife populations that share these environments. The psychological impact of the incident extended throughout the Arctic work community, with many experienced workers reporting increased anxiety and stress related to their jobs. Support groups were established to help workers process their fears and develop coping strategies for the heightened awareness of danger that followed the attack. Everyone who works in the Arctic knows the risks, explained Dr. Mitchell, the trauma psychologist. But when something like this happens to people you know and respect, it makes those risks feel much more immediate and personal. Many workers reported difficulty sleeping, increased hypervigilance, and intrusive thoughts about polar bear encounters. The incident also highlighted the limitations of rescue operations in extreme Arctic conditions. Despite having sophisticated emergency response protocols and equipment, the rescue teams were unable to prevent the tragedy or recover Henry's body due to weather conditions and the vast distances involved. Emergency Response Coordinator Linda Harrison acknowledged these limitations in her post-incident analysis. "We have excellent capabilities for Arctic rescue operations, but we are still constrained by weather, geography, and physics. When conditions deteriorate to the level we experienced during this incident, even our best equipment and most experienced personnel may not be able to provide timely assistance." The families of the victims established a memorial fund to support Arctic safety research and polar bear conservation efforts. The Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark Memorial Fund has provided grants for improved safety equipment, wildlife research, and educational programs designed to reduce conflicts between humans and polar bears. These men died doing important work in one of the world's most challenging environments, said Margaret Ross, speaking at the fund's inaugural dinner. The best way we can honor their memory is by working to ensure that future Arctic workers can do their jobs safely while respecting the wildlife that calls the Arctic home. 1 year after the incident, a memorial ceremony was held at Prudhoe Bay, attended by family members, colleagues, and officials from throughout the Arctic industry. The ceremony included the dedication of a monument bearing the names of all three victims and a pledge to continue working toward improved safety in Arctic operations. The monument, constructed from black granite and positioned to overlook the vast Arctic landscape where the men died, bears a simple inscription: "In memory of Mark Anthony Dawson, Anthony Michael Ross, and Henry James Clark, who gave their lives in service to their families and their communities. Their sacrifice reminds us that the Arctic demands our respect, our preparation, and our vigilance." Father Thomas McDougall, who conducted the memorial service, reflected on the broader meaning of the tragedy. The Arctic has always been a place where human courage and determination are tested against the awesome power of nature. Mark, Tony, and Henry understood these risks and accepted them as part of their calling. Their deaths remind us that our technological achievements and industrial capabilities do not exempt us from nature's laws. The investigation's final report, released 18 months after the incident, concluded with recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. These recommendations included mandatory polar bear deterrent systems for all Arctic work sites, improved vehicle reliability standards for extreme conditions, enhanced communication protocols, and expanded emergency response capabilities. However, the report also acknowledged that some risks are inherent to Arctic operations and cannot be completely eliminated. Working in the Arctic will always involve accepting certain risks, the report concluded. Our responsibility is to minimize those risks through proper preparation, training, and equipment, while acknowledging that nature ultimately remains beyond human control. The three families affected by the tragedy have each found different ways to cope with their losses and honor the memories of their loved ones. Margaret Ross has become an advocate for Arctic worker safety, speaking at conferences and working with industry groups to promote improved safety standards. Tony would want his death to mean something, Margaret explained during one of her presentations. If his experience can help prevent other families from going through what we've endured, then maybe some good can come from this terrible tragedy. Jennifer Clark, Henry's ex-wife, has focused on helping their daughters Emma and Sophie understand their father's sacrifice and maintain positive memories of him despite the tragic circumstances of his death. Henry made mistakes in his personal life, but he was genuinely trying to build a better future for his girls, Jennifer said. I want them to remember him as someone who worked hard and took risks to provide for his family, not just as someone who died in a horrible way. Mark Dawson's memorial has been maintained by his sister-in-law and her family in Arizona, where Mark had planned to retire. His ashes were scattered in the Arizona desert he had hoped to call home, providing a final resting place far from the frozen landscape where he died. Mark always said the Arctic was a young man's game, and he was looking forward to warming his old bones in the desert, his sister-in-law recalled. It breaks our hearts that he never got that chance, but we know he's at peace now. The polar bear attack at Prudhoe Bay on February 21, 2025, stands as one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed wildlife attacks in Arctic history. The extensive investigation, media coverage, and ongoing research have provided valuable insights into polar bear behavior, Arctic survival challenges, and the complex relationship between industrial activity and wildlife conservation. Dr. Morrison's long-term study of the incident and its aftermath concluded that the attack represented a convergence of environmental, biological, and human factors that created an almost inevitable tragedy. When we examine all the circumstances involved, he wrote, it becomes clear that this incident was not simply a case of human bad luck or poor judgment. It was the predictable result of placing humans in close proximity to stressed wildlife under extreme environmental conditions. The incident has also contributed to broader discussions about climate change and its impact on Arctic ecosystems. The unusual ice conditions that drove the polar bear inland were consistent with patterns observed throughout the Arctic as warming temperatures disrupt traditional seasonal cycles. Climate scientist Dr. Amanda Foster has used the Prudhoe Bay incident as a case study in her research on climate change impacts. What happened to these three men represents a microcosm of the larger changes occurring throughout the Arctic. As traditional patterns break down, we can expect more frequent conflicts between human activities and wildlife populations that are struggling to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The technological and procedural changes implemented following the incident have been adopted throughout the Arctic industry, potentially preventing similar tragedies. Improved vehicle designs, enhanced communication systems, and mandatory safety equipment have reduced the risks faced by Arctic workers, though they cannot eliminate them entirely. Industry safety consultant Robert Chen, who helped develop new protocols following the incident, believes the changes represent a significant improvement in worker protection. We can never guarantee that incidents like this won't happen again, but we've made substantial improvements in our ability to prevent them and respond when they do occur. The story of Mark Dawson, Tony Ross and Henry Clark continues to resonate throughout the Arctic work community as a reminder of the risks faced by those who work in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Their deaths were not in vain if they help prevent future tragedies and promote greater understanding of the delicate balance between human activity and wildlife conservation in the Arctic. 5 years after the incident, the Arctic landscape near Prudhoe Bay appears unchanged to the casual observer. The pipeline continues to carry oil across the frozen wilderness. Work crews continue to perform maintenance and repairs, and polar bears continue to roam the ice in search of food. However, for those who knew Mark, Tony, and Henry, the landscape is forever marked by their memory and their sacrifice. The monument to the three men has become a pilgrimage site for Arctic workers, who often visit to pay their respects and reflect on the risks they accept as part of their calling. The inscription on the monument serves as a daily reminder that the Arctic demands respect, preparation, and vigilance from all who venture into its domain. The families of the victims have found some measure of peace in the years following the tragedy, though the pain of their losses remains. They have been comforted by the knowledge that their loved ones' deaths led to meaningful improvements in Arctic safety and contributed to a better understanding of the challenges faced by those who work in extreme environments. The polar bear attack at Prudhoe Bay on February 21, 2025, will be remembered as a tragic reminder of nature's power and the courage of those who risk their lives to provide the energy resources that modern society depends upon. Mark Anthony Dawson, Anthony Michael Ross, and Henry James Clark died as they lived, facing the challenges of the Arctic with determination, skill, and dedication to their work and their families. Their story serves as a testament to the inherent dangers of industrial operations in wilderness environments and the ongoing need for vigilance, respect, and preparation when humans venture into the domain of Earth's most formidable predators. The Arctic remains a place where human technology and determination are constantly tested against the awesome power of nature, and where the price of failure can be measured in human lives. In the end, the tragedy at Prudhoe Bay represents both a specific incident and a universal truth about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Despite our technological capabilities and industrial achievements, we remain vulnerable to the forces of nature and the behavior of wild animals that follow instincts developed over thousands of years of evolution. The memory of Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark will continue to influence Arctic safety protocols and wildlife management policies for years to come. Their sacrifice has contributed to a better understanding of polar bear behavior, improved safety equipment and procedures, and enhanced emergency response capabilities that will protect future generations of Arctic workers. Their story is ultimately one of human courage in the face of overwhelming natural forces, professional dedication under extreme conditions, and the tragic intersection of human activity with wildlife behavior in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The Arctic has claimed 3 more lives, but their deaths have not been meaningless if they help prevent similar tragedies and promote greater respect for the awesome power of the polar wilderness. The investigation into their deaths revealed no human failures or negligence, only the harsh reality that working in the Arctic involves accepting risks that cannot be completely controlled or eliminated. Mark, Tony, and Henry understood these risks and accepted them as part of their profession, and their courage in facing these dangers while providing essential services to society deserves recognition and respect. Today, the Arctic continues to challenge those who work in its domain, testing their skills, equipment, and determination against an environment that has remained largely unchanged, despite human technological advances. The lessons learned from the deaths of Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark continue to inform safety protocols and emergency procedures, ensuring that their sacrifice contributes to the protection of future Arctic workers. The memorial fund established in their honor continues to support research into Arctic safety and polar bear conservation, creating a lasting legacy that extends far beyond the tragic circumstances of their deaths. Through this fund and the safety improvements implemented following their deaths, Mark, Tony, and Henry continue to contribute to the safety and success of Arctic operations. Their story reminds us that heroism is often found not in dramatic gestures or extraordinary circumstances, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people who accept extraordinary risks as part of their daily work. Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark were not seeking glory or recognition when they died. They were simply doing their jobs with the skill and dedication that characterized their entire careers. The polar bear attack at Prudhoe Bay stands as a stark reminder that the Arctic remains one of Earth's most challenging and dangerous environments, where the margin for error is small and the consequences of failure can be fatal. However, it also demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit and the commitment of those who continue to work in these extreme conditions, despite the known risks. As long as human society depends on the resources extracted from Arctic regions, there will be men and women who accept the risks and challenges of working in these extreme environments. The memory of Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark serves as both an inspiration and a warning to those who follow in their footsteps, reminding them that respect for the Arctic and its wildlife is not merely advisable but essential for survival. The Arctic keeps its secrets well, and Henry Clark's body remains somewhere in the vast wilderness, a final reminder of nature's power and the price sometimes paid by those who venture into its domain. His disappearance serves as a sobering reminder that in the Arctic, not all stories have clear endings and not all questions can be answered. The three families forever changed by the events of February 21st, 2025, continue to honor the memory of their loved ones while building new lives shaped by their loss. Their strength and resilience serve as a testament to the human capacity for healing and growth, even in the face of tragic and senseless loss. The story of the polar bear attack at Prudhoe Bay will continue to be told in safety briefings, training sessions, and industry conferences as a cautionary tale that illustrates both the risks of Arctic work and the importance of constant vigilance. It serves as a reminder that in the Arctic, complacency can be fatal, and that respect for the environment and its wildlife is not optional but essential. In the end, Mark Anthony Dawson, Anthony Michael Ross, and Henry James Clark died as they lived. As professionals dedicated to their work, colleagues committed to each other's safety, and men who understood that their chosen profession required them to face risks that most people will never encounter. Their courage, skill, and dedication will be remembered long after the details of their tragic deaths have faded from memory. The Arctic wilderness that claimed their lives continues to challenge and inspire those who work in its domain, offering both incredible beauty and mortal danger to those who venture into its frozen landscape. The lessons learned from their sacrifice continue to protect other Arctic workers, ensuring that their deaths contribute to the safety and success of future operations in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Their memory serves as both an inspiration and a warning, reminding us that the Arctic demands our respect, our preparation, and our constant vigilance. In honoring their memory, we commit ourselves to learning from their experience and working to prevent similar tragedies, while recognizing that some risks are inherent to working in Earth's most extreme environments. The story of February 21st, 2025 at Prudhoe Bay will forever stand as a reminder of the price sometimes paid by those who extract the resources that power modern civilization from the Earth's most challenging environments. Mark Dawson, Tony Ross, and Henry Clark paid that price with their lives, but their sacrifice continues to protect others who follow in their footsteps into the beautiful and dangerous Arctic wilderness. The next stories. November 18th, 2025. Grizzly Moles. 2 hikers in Colorado in under 4 minutes. The morning mist clung to the aspen trees like ghostly fingers as Jessica Marie Allen adjusted her backpack straps for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. At 29, she had hiked countless trails across Colorado's Front Range, but something about this particular November morning felt different. The air carried an unusual stillness, broken only by the distant call of a Clark's nutcracker and the soft crunch of frost-brittle leaves beneath their boots. "You're overthinking this, Jess," David Michael Wright said, his breath forming small clouds in the 30-degree air. At 34, David had been Jessica's hiking partner for almost 2 years, ever since they'd met at a mountaineering equipment store in Boulder. His weathered hands, scarred from years of rock climbing and backcountry adventures, worked methodically to secure his camera equipment, a Canon R5 with a telephoto lens that had cost him 3 months' salary from his job as a software engineer at a Denver startup. Jessica paused at the Lily Lake trailhead, studying the weathered wooden sign that detailed the route ahead. Bear Lake Trail, 0.8 miles to Bear Lake, elevation gain 300 feet. Below it, a newer laminated notice caught her attention. Bear activity increased in this area. November 2025, last reported sighting. November 15th, adult male grizzly, approximately 400 to 500 pounds, observed near Nymph Lake area. Hikers advised to carry bear spray and make noise while hiking. 3rd time this week they've updated that sign, observed Margaret Hendricks, a 62-year-old retired park ranger who was preparing for her own solo hike to Alberta Falls. Margaret had worked Rocky Mountain National Park for 37 years before retiring in 2023, and her intimate knowledge of the local wildlife had made her something of a local celebrity among hiking groups. "That's the same bear that got into the campground garbage 2 weeks ago. Big male, probably around 10 years old, approximately 450 pounds based on the paw prints we measured." David pulled out his phone to check the weather forecast one more time. The Colorado Department of Transportation had issued winter weather advisories for elevations above 10,000 feet, but their intended route to Bear Lake at 9,475 feet should remain clear. The temperature was expected to climb to just above freezing by afternoon, with partly cloudy skies and minimal wind. Perfect conditions for photography, David thought, envisioning the shots he might capture of the lake's partially frozen surface, reflecting the surrounding peaks. "You two be extra careful up there today," Margaret continued, zipping her own bright orange jacket. "I've been tracking that male's movement patterns, and he's been ranging wider than usual for this time of year. Most grizzlies should be in pre-denning behavior by now, but this one's still actively foraging. Could be because of the late berry season this year, or maybe he's a young male still establishing territory." Jessica felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, the same sensation she'd experienced 3 months earlier when they'd encountered a black bear on the Emerald Lake Trail. That encounter had ended peacefully, with the bear showing minimal interest in the humans before wandering off toward a grove of choke cherry bushes. But grizzlies were different. At her home in Longmont, Jessica had spent hours reading about grizzly encounters, studying the horrific mauling cases that seemed to make headlines every few years across the Mountain West. "We've got bear spray," David said, patting the canister clipped to his belt. It was a new 10-ounce container of counter-assault, purchased just 2 days earlier after Jessica had insisted they upgrade from their smaller backup canister. Plus, it's a popular trail, lots of other hikers around. At 7:43 a.m., they began their ascent. The trail started as a wide, well-maintained path winding through dense stands of aspen and lodgepole pine. Jessica noticed how the early morning light filtered through the bare aspen branches, creating a complex pattern of shadows that shifted with each gust of wind. The ground was covered with a thin layer of overnight frost that crunched satisfyingly beneath their hiking boots. Jessica wore her trusted Merrell Moab 3s, while David preferred his newer Salomon X Ultra 4s. 20 minutes into their hike, they encountered their first other people of the day, Thomas and Maria Santos, a couple in their 40s from Phoenix, Arizona, who were descending after an early morning photography session. Thomas carried a massive Nikon D850 with what appeared to be a 600mm lens, while Maria had a smaller mirrorless camera slung across her chest. "How were conditions up there?" David asked, automatically falling into the familiar rhythm of trail conversation. "Absolutely gorgeous," Maria replied, her enthusiasm evident despite the early hour. "The lake is about 60% frozen over, and the reflection of Hallett Peak in the open water is incredible. We got there right at sunrise, maybe 6:30 or so, and had the whole place to ourselves for about an hour." "See any wildlife?" Jessica inquired, trying to keep her voice casual. Thomas and Maria exchanged a look that made Jessica's stomach tighten. "Actually, yeah," Thomas said slowly. "We saw some pretty fresh tracks near the lake outlet. Big tracks." Maria took some photos. He gestured to his wife, who was already scrolling through images on her camera's LCD screen. "Here," Maria said, holding out her camera. The image showed a clear paw print in soft mud near the lake's edge. Even on the small camera screen, Jessica could see that the print was massive, easily 5 inches across, with distinct claw marks extending another 2 inches beyond the toes. "That's definitely grizzly," David said, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when discussing technical climbing routes. "Front paw, probably. The claws are way too long for black bear." Thomas nodded grimly. "We've been hiking in bear country for 15 years, and we've never seen prints that fresh. The mud around it was still soft, like the bear had been there within the last hour or two. Maybe even more recent." "Did you see the actual bear?" Jessica asked. "No, but we heard some crashing around in the willows on the north side of the lake," Maria replied. "Could have been elk, but the way the sound moved, I don't know. It seemed too purposeful, too heavy. Like something big was moving through the brush deliberately, not just grazing." After the Santos couple continued down the trail, David and Jessica stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The morning had grown slightly warmer, and Jessica could feel sweat beginning to form beneath her base layer despite the cool air. She pulled out her water bottle, a 32-ounce Nalgene filled with water and a single electrolyte tablet, and took a long drink. "We could turn back," David said quietly, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to. Jessica looked up the trail, which curved around a large boulder outcropping and disappeared into a grove of evergreens. She had been looking forward to this hike for weeks, planning it as a way to decompress from a particularly stressful period at her job as a marketing director for a sustainable energy company in Boulder. The work had been consuming her life, 12-hour days, weekend conference calls, and a project deadline that seemed to move further away despite her team's best efforts. "The Santos didn't see the actual bear," she said, more to convince herself than David. "And that track could have been from yesterday or even the day before. It rained 2 nights ago, right? So if it's still clear, it must be more recent, but not necessarily from this morning." David nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Plus, we've got the spray, we're making plenty of noise, and it's a popular trail. Even if we do run into something, bears usually want to avoid humans as much as we want to avoid them. At 8:15 a.m. they resumed hiking. The trail began to climb more steeply now, switchbacking through a mixed forest of Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and scattered limber pines. Jessica found her rhythm in the familiar cadence of uphill hiking. Steady, measured steps, breathing deeply through her nose, using her trekking poles to maintain balance on the increasingly rocky terrain. They passed two more groups of descending hikers over the next 30 minutes. A trio of college students from Colorado State University who'd attempted to camp at Bear Lake the previous night before being turned away by a park ranger, and an elderly man walking alone with a small, well-behaved terrier mix. The college students mentioned seeing some kind of large animal tracks near Nymph Lake, but hadn't thought much of it. The elderly man, who introduced himself as Dr. Robert Chen, a retired veterinarian from Fort Collins, had hiked this trail weekly for the past 12 years and seemed unconcerned about wildlife. "Bears are getting ready to den," Dr. Chen explained, adjusting his dog's leash as the terrier sniffed enthusiastically at a nearby tree trunk. This time of year, they're focused on finding a good denning site and putting on those final pounds of fat. Unless you get between a sow and her cubs or surprise one feeding, they generally want nothing to do with humans. "What about males?" David asked. "We heard there's been a big male seen in the area recently." Dr. Chen nodded knowingly. "Males can be more unpredictable, especially younger ones still establishing territory. But even then, they're usually more interested in food sources than people. Just make noise. Give them space if you see them, and you should be fine." As they continued upward, Jessica noticed that the forest was becoming quieter. The chattering of chipmunks and the calls of various bird species that had accompanied them for the first half hour of the hike had gradually faded. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving only the sound of their own footsteps and breathing. At 9:02 a.m., they reached Nymph Lake, a small alpine pond surrounded by willows and scattered boulders. The lake was completely frozen over, its surface covered with a thin layer of snow that had fallen 3 days earlier. Jessica paused to take some photos with her iPhone, though she knew they wouldn't capture the subtle beauty of the morning light reflecting off the ice. "Look at that," David said, pointing to the muddy area near the lake's inlet. Even from 20 feet away, they could both clearly see the massive paw prints Maria Santos had photographed earlier. There were multiple prints now, both front and rear paws, creating a clear trail that led from the water's edge into the willow thickets on the lake's north shore. Jessica felt her heart rate increase as she studied the tracks. They were incredibly fresh, with sharp, well-defined edges that showed no signs of weathering or erosion. Worse, when she knelt down to examine them more closely, she could see that some of the prints showed tiny droplets of what looked like water around the edges, as if the bear had stepped in these spots while the mud was still wet from morning dew. "These are from this morning," she said quietly. "Maybe within the last couple of hours." David was scanning the willows with his binoculars, moving slowly from left to right across the dense thicket. "I don't see anything moving," he reported, but his voice carried a tension that hadn't been there earlier. "But there's a lot of thick cover in there. A bear could be 50 feet away and we'd never know it." They stood in silence for several minutes, listening intently for any sounds from the willows. Jessica became acutely aware of every small noise. The distant drip of melting frost from tree branches, the soft rustle of dry leaves in an almost imperceptible breeze, the faint creaking of tree trunks contracting in the cool air. Nothing suggested the presence of a large animal, but somehow the very silence felt ominous. "Should we turn back?" Jessica asked. David checked his watch. "We're more than halfway to Bear Lake, another 20 minutes max. And look." He pointed up the trail where they could see 2 other hikers ascending ahead of them. "We're not alone up here." At 9:18 a.m., they left Nymph Lake and continued toward Bear Lake. This section of trail was even steeper, climbing through a series of tight switchbacks carved into a granite slope. The vegetation changed noticeably here, with the dense forest giving way to more open terrain, scattered with large boulders and stunted trees. Jessica found herself glancing frequently over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a sensation she had never experienced before while hiking, a prickling awareness that seemed to radiate from the base of her skull down her spine. She tried to rationalize it as simple anxiety from seeing the fresh bear tracks, but the feeling persisted and seemed to intensify as they climbed higher. The two hikers ahead of them were making good time, and by 9:35 a.m., Jessica and David could no longer see them through the trees. They were alone again on the trail, surrounded by the vast silence of the high-altitude forest. At 9:42 a.m., they crested the final rise and saw Bear Lake spread out below them. The lake was stunning, a perfect alpine jewel nestled in a cirque surrounded by dramatic granite peaks. Hallett Peak rose to the south, its snow-covered summit gleaming in the morning sun, while Flattop Mountain dominated the western skyline. Just as Maria Santos had described, about 60% of the lake's surface was frozen, with the remaining open water reflecting the surrounding peaks like a giant mirror. "This is why we do this," David said softly, already reaching for his camera equipment. "This is absolutely perfect." They descended the short, steep trail to the lake's shore and found a flat granite slab near the water's edge, where they could set up for photography and an early lunch. David began assembling his tripod while Jessica unpacked their food, sandwiches she had made the previous evening, a thermos of coffee, some dried fruit and chocolate bars. The lake was as peaceful as any place Jessica had ever been. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of small waves against the ice edge and the occasional distant call of a grey jay. David worked methodically, taking dozens of shots from different angles, experimenting with various focal lengths and compositions. At 10:15 a.m., while David was focused on capturing a particular reflection shot, Jessica noticed movement in her peripheral vision. She turned to look and felt her blood freeze. Approximately 150 yards away, on the far side of the lake, near a cluster of large boulders, a massive brown shape was moving slowly along the shoreline. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What?" he replied, not looking up from his camera. "David, there's a bear." This time he looked up immediately, following her gaze across the lake. Even without binoculars, the animal was clearly visible, an enormous grizzly bear, its thick brown coat gleaming in the morning sunlight. The bear was moving with the distinctive rolling gait that characterized its species, occasionally pausing to sniff at something on the ground or in the rocks. "Holy shit," David breathed. "That thing is massive." The bear seemed unaware of their presence, continuing its slow progression along the far shore. Jessica estimated its size at somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds, with a shoulder height that would easily reach her chest if she were standing next to it. Its head was enormous, broader and more rounded than any black bear she had ever seen, and even from this distance she could see the distinctive shoulder hump that marked it unmistakably as a grizzly. "What do we do?" Jessica whispered. "We stay calm. We don't make any sudden movements, and we slowly start packing up our stuff," David replied, his voice steady but tense. "It's all the way across the lake. If we're quiet and careful, we can get out of here before it even knows we're here." But as David reached slowly for his tripod, the bear suddenly stopped and raised its head, seeming to test the air with its nose. For a moment that felt like an eternity. The animal stood perfectly still, and Jessica had the terrible feeling that it was looking directly at them. Then, with movements that seemed impossibly fast for such a large animal, the bear began moving around the lake toward them. "It's coming this way," Jessica said, fighting to keep panic out of her voice. "Okay, new plan," David said, his hands moving with deliberate slowness as he detached his camera from the tripod. "We're going to pack up as quickly as we can without running, and then we're going to back away from the lake slowly. Don't make eye contact, don't make sudden movements, just move slowly and deliberately." The bear was now moving with clear purpose, covering ground at a pace that seemed to Jessica both incredibly fast and terrifyingly deliberate. It wasn't running exactly, but rather moving in a steady, rolling lope that ate up the distance around the lake's perimeter with alarming efficiency. Jessica's hands shook as she tried to pack their food back into her day pack. The chocolate bar slipped from her fingers and fell onto the granite slab, but when she started to reach for it, David grabbed her arm. "Leave it," he said. "We need to go now." They shouldered their packs and began backing away from the lakeshore, moving as quickly as they dared, while trying to maintain the slow, non-threatening movements that every piece of bear safety advice recommended. Jessica felt her heart hammering in her chest so hard she was sure the bear would be able to hear it from across the lake. The bear had now covered about half the distance around the lake and was moving even faster. Jessica could see details now that made her stomach clench with fear. The animal's enormous paws, each the size of a dinner plate, the thick muscles rippling beneath its fur, the small, dark eyes that seemed fixed on their location. "It's definitely coming for us," David said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "When I say run, we run straight up the trail. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run as fast as you can." They had backed about 50 yards up the trail from the lake when the bear broke into an unmistakable charge. The change was instant and terrifying. One moment the animal had been moving with what seemed like casual purpose, and the next it was thundering toward them at a full gallop, covering ground with a speed that seemed to defy physics. "Run!" David shouted. Jessica turned and sprinted up the trail with every ounce of strength in her body. Behind her, she could hear the bear crashing through the brush and rocks with sounds like a freight train bearing down on them. The animal was making noise now too, deep, guttural huffing sounds that seemed to come from somewhere primal and terrifying. The trail seemed impossibly steep as Jessica ran, her legs burning with effort, her lungs screaming for air in the thin mountain atmosphere. She could hear David's footsteps behind her, along with his labored breathing, but the sounds of the pursuing bear seemed to be getting closer with each passing second. 30 seconds into their flight, Jessica risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The bear was much closer than she had expected, maybe 40 or 50 yards behind them, and looked even more enormous than it had from across the lake. Its mouth was open, revealing teeth that seemed far too large and sharp, and its eyes held a terrifying intelligence that suggested this was not a random encounter, but a deliberate hunt. "Bear spray!" David yelled from behind her. "Get ready with the bear spray!" Jessica's hands fumbled for the canister on her belt, her fine motor control compromised by adrenaline and terror. The clip seemed impossibly complicated, her fingers refusing to work properly as she tried to free the spray while continuing to run. They had covered perhaps 200 yards up the trail when the inevitable happened. Jessica's left foot caught a root or rock that she hadn't seen, and she went down hard, skidding across the rocky trail surface and rolling several feet down a steep embankment to the right of the trail. David, unable to stop his momentum, ran several more steps before he could turn around. "Jessica!" he shouted, starting to scramble down toward her. Jessica had landed hard on her left side and felt a sharp pain in her ribs, but adrenaline kept her moving. She could see the bear now crashing through the trees above them, perhaps 25 yards away, and closing fast. The animal had slowed slightly when they fell, but was still moving toward them with obvious intent. "Stay down!" David yelled, finally managing to get his own bear spray free from his belt. "I've got the spray!" But the bear was on them before David could properly aim the canister. The animal appeared at the top of the embankment like something from a nightmare, enormous, powerful, and moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for its size. David had time to point the spray canister in the bear's general direction and trigger a burst, but the wind was wrong, and most of the spray dispersed harmlessly to one side. The grizzly dropped down the embankment in a single bound and hit David like a freight train. Jessica, lying 15 feet away, watched in horror as the bear's massive paw struck David in the chest, lifting him off the ground and slamming him against a large pine tree with a sickening thud. David's scream was cut short as the impact drove all the air from his lungs. The bear was on him immediately, its massive jaws clamping down on his left shoulder with a crushing force that Jessica could hear, a wet, grinding sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Get away from him!" Jessica screamed, scrambling to her feet despite the pain in her ribs. She grabbed the largest rock she could find, a piece of granite about the size of a softball, and hurled it at the bear's head. The rock struck the animal in the shoulder, but seemed to have no effect whatsoever. The bear shook David like a rag doll, its powerful neck muscles twisting his body from side to side before releasing him and stepping back. David collapsed to the ground, blood streaming from massive puncture wounds in his shoulder and upper chest. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and his face was white with shock and blood loss. "Jessica," he gasped, trying to speak through the pain. "Run!" But the bear wasn't finished. It reared up on its hind legs, towering nearly 8 feet above them, and let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees around them. Then it dropped back down and lunged forward again, this time targeting David's head and neck. Jessica acted without thinking. She pulled her own bear spray from her belt, managed to get the safety off, and sprayed directly at the bear's face from a distance of less than 10 feet. This time, the wind conditions were perfect, and the orange cloud of capsaicin concentrate hit the animal squarely in the eyes and nose. The bear's reaction was immediate and dramatic. It released David instantly and began pawing at its face, shaking its massive head from side to side and making sounds of pain and rage. It backed away from them, still pawing at its eyes, and for a moment Jessica dared to hope that they might escape. But grizzly bears, even partially blinded, are still incredibly dangerous animals. Instead of retreating, the bear seemed to become even more enraged by the chemical spray. It charged again, this time directly at Jessica. She tried to run, but her injured ribs and the steep terrain made it impossible to move quickly enough. The bear caught her after just 3 steps, its massive paw striking her in the back and sending her tumbling down the embankment into a small ravine she hadn't even noticed during their flight. Jessica hit the bottom of the ravine hard, feeling something in her left leg snap with an audible crack. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but she could still hear the bear crashing through the brush above her, still making those terrible huffing and roaring sounds. She tried to crawl deeper into the ravine, hoping to find some kind of shelter or hiding place, but her broken leg wouldn't support any weight, and her injured ribs made it difficult to breathe. She could hear David moaning somewhere above her, which meant he was still alive, but she had no idea how badly he was hurt or whether either of them would survive the next few minutes. The bear appeared at the edge of the ravine, looking down at her with eyes that were still streaming from the pepper spray, but were clearly able to see well enough to locate her. The animal seemed to be considering whether to follow her down into the narrow space or to return to David. For a moment that stretched out like an eternity, woman and bear stared at each other across the 10-foot distance that separated them. Jessica found herself looking directly into the animal's small, dark eyes, and seeing an intelligence there that was both fascinating and terrifying. This was not a mindless killing machine, but a thinking, reasoning creature that was making decisions about her fate. Then, inexplicably, the bear turned away from the ravine and disappeared back into the brush. Jessica could hear it moving around above her for several more minutes, and then the sounds gradually faded until the forest returned to an eerie silence, broken only by David's labored breathing and her own heart pounding in her ears. Jessica lay in the bottom of the ravine for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. afraid to move or make any sound that might bring the bear back. Her leg was definitely broken. She could see the unnatural angle of her lower leg and feel the grinding sensation of broken bones moving against each other whenever she tried to shift position. Her ribs were probably cracked as well, making each breath a sharp stab of pain. "David," she finally whispered as loudly as she dared. "I'm here," came a weak reply from somewhere above her. "I'm hurt pretty bad, Jess. My shoulder it's really messed up." "Can you move?" "A little. I think my arm is broken and I'm bleeding a lot. The bear, it got my shoulder pretty good." Jessica tried to assess her own injuries more thoroughly. In addition to the obvious broken leg and injured ribs, she had multiple cuts and scrapes from her fall down the embankment. Her left hand was swollen and painful, possibly with a broken finger or two, but she was alive, conscious, and able to think clearly, which seemed like a miracle given what had just happened. "We need to call for help," she said, reaching for her cell phone. The screen was cracked, but the device still powered on. No signal, of course. They were in a dead zone that she remembered from previous hikes in this area. "My phone's in my pack," David said. "I don't know where my pack ended up when the bear hit me." Jessica tried to remember the exact details of their attack. The whole encounter, from the moment the bear began charging until it disappeared back into the forest, had lasted less than 4 minutes. But those 4 minutes had changed everything. They were both seriously injured, trapped in a remote location with no immediate way to call for help, and somewhere in the forest around them was a large, aggressive grizzly bear that had already attacked them once. "Someone will come looking for us," Jessica said, as much to reassure herself as David. "When we don't come home tonight, people will notice. And this is a popular trail. Other hikers will find us." But even as she spoke, Jessica realized the flaws in this reasoning. It was only Monday morning, and neither of them was expected anywhere until Jessica's workday began on Tuesday. David lived alone and often disappeared for multi-day hiking or climbing trips without telling anyone his exact plans. Her own roommate, Sarah, was spending the week in San Francisco on a business trip and wouldn't be back until Wednesday. It could be days before anyone realized they were missing. Over the next several hours, Jessica gradually managed to crawl out of the ravine and make her way to where David was lying against the base of the pine tree. The sight of his injuries made her stomach lurch with nausea and fear. The bear's claws and teeth had left deep puncture wounds across his left shoulder and upper chest. His shirt was soaked with blood, and she could see what looked like exposed bone through one of the larger tears in his flesh. "We need to stop the bleeding," Jessica said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Her first aid knowledge was limited to a basic wilderness medicine course she had taken 3 years earlier, but she remembered the fundamentals of trauma care. Using David's knife, she cut strips from her spare shirt and fashioned makeshift bandages for the worst of his wounds. The bleeding seemed to slow somewhat, but David was clearly going into shock. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing was shallow and rapid, and he was having difficulty staying focused on their conversation. "I'm really cold," he said, which Jessica recognized as another sign of shock despite the fact that the afternoon temperature had climbed to nearly 50 degrees. She covered him with everything she could find, both their jackets, her spare fleece, even the emergency space blanket from her first aid kit. But David's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the afternoon. By evening, he was drifting in and out of consciousness, and Jessica was beginning to face the possibility that he might not survive the night. Her own injuries were serious, but not immediately life-threatening. The broken leg made it impossible for her to walk more than a few steps, effectively trapping them both in this location until help arrived. But she could remain alert and functional, which meant she would have to be the one to signal for rescue when the opportunity arose. As darkness fell, Jessica heard the first helicopter. The sound of rotor blades echoing off the surrounding peaks was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard, but the aircraft passed overhead without stopping. She tried waving David's bright red jacket, but either the crew didn't see her or they were simply conducting a routine patrol rather than an active search. The helicopter returned 3 more times over the next 2 hours, each pass seeming to cover a different section of the trail system. On the 4th pass, the aircraft hovered directly overhead for several minutes, and Jessica was able to use David's camera flash to signal their location. The helicopter's searchlights swept back and forth across the forest below them, and she was certain the crew had spotted them when the light lingered on their position for nearly 30 seconds. But then the helicopter moved on, and the forest returned to darkness and silence. "They saw us," Jessica said, as much to convince herself as to reassure David. "They definitely saw us. They'll be back with a ground crew." David's response was barely audible, and Jessica realized that his breathing had become even more labored. She checked his pulse and found it rapid and weak, all signs that he was losing the fight against blood loss and shock. The rescue team found them at 2:17 a.m. on November 19th, nearly 18 hours after the bear attack. Jessica heard voices calling their names from the trail above, followed by the beams of powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness. She responded with shouts and whistle blasts, guiding the rescuers to their location in the ravine below the main trail. The team consisted of 6 members from Rocky Mountain National Park's Search and Rescue Unit, along with 2 paramedics from the Estes Park Emergency Medical Services. Team leader Michael Rodriguez had been coordinating mountain rescues in the park for 12 years and had seen every type of wilderness emergency imaginable. But the scene that greeted them was among the most disturbing of his career. "We've got 2 victims, both with serious injuries consistent with a large animal attack," Rodriguez radioed to the incident commander at the trailhead. "The male victim is in critical condition with massive blood loss, possible internal injuries and signs of severe shock. Female victim is conscious and alert, but has an obvious leg fracture and possible internal injuries from a fall." The paramedics immediately went to work on David, establishing an IV line and administering fluids and pain medication while assessing the extent of his injuries. Lead paramedic Susan Chen, a veteran of 15 years in mountain emergency medicine, had treated bear attack victims before, but she was shocked by the severity of David's wounds. "These are some of the worst injuries I've seen from a wildlife encounter," she told Rodriguez quietly. "Multiple deep puncture wounds, probable pneumothorax from the chest injuries, possible damage to major blood vessels in the shoulder. He's lost a massive amount of blood, and his vital signs are barely stable. We need to get him out of here immediately." The evacuation process was complicated by the difficult terrain and the need to transport both victims safely in darkness. The rescue team had to construct a technical rope system to raise David from the ravine to the main trail level, a process that took nearly 2 hours. Jessica's evacuation was somewhat easier due to her conscious state and ability to assist with her own rescue, but her broken leg still required careful handling to prevent further injury. At 5:45 a.m., both victims were loaded aboard medical helicopters for transport to Medical Center of the Rockies in Loveland, Colorado. David was unconscious and on life support, while Jessica remained awake and coherent despite her injuries and exhaustion. The medical team at MCR was led by Dr. Amanda Foster, a trauma surgeon with extensive experience treating wildlife attack victims. Dr. Foster's first assessment of David's condition was grimly professional. Multiple puncture wounds to the left shoulder, chest, and neck area, consistent with a large bear attack. Probable laceration of the subclavian artery, collapsed lung, multiple rib fractures, and a severely displaced fracture of the left humerus. Patient is in hemorrhagic shock and will require immediate surgery. David underwent emergency surgery that lasted nearly 7 hours. during which Dr. Foster and her team worked to repair the damage to his circulatory system, re-inflate his collapsed lung, and stabilize the multiple fractures. The surgical report noted extensive soft tissue damage and massive blood loss requiring transfusion of 12 units of whole blood and plasma. Jessica's injuries, while serious, were more straightforward to treat. Orthopedic surgeon Dr. James Liu repaired her fractured tibia and fibula with surgical plates and screws, while other doctors treated her broken ribs, fractured hand, and numerous cuts and abrasions. She was conscious throughout most of her treatment and was able to provide a detailed account of the attack to investigators. The investigation into the bear attack was led by Colorado Parks and Wildlife District Manager Sarah Martinez, working in coordination with Rocky Mountain National Park officials. Martinez had investigated dozens of bear encounters during her 20-year career with CPW, but the circumstances of this attack were unusual enough to warrant a comprehensive investigation. Based on the victim's account and the physical evidence at the scene, this appears to have been an unprovoked attack by a large male grizzly bear, Martinez explained to the media during a press conference 2 days after the incident. The bear approached the victims while they were at Bear Lake, pursued them when they attempted to leave the area, and attacked them aggressively when they fell during their escape attempt. Wildlife officials found extensive physical evidence at the attack site, including paw prints, claw marks on trees, blood evidence, and scattered camping equipment. Most importantly, they recovered David's camera equipment, which had continued recording during portions of the attack sequence. The footage, while disturbing, provided valuable insights into the bear's behavior and confirmed the victim's account of the encounter. The camera footage shows a very large grizzly bear, estimated at 450 to 500 pounds, behaving in an unusually aggressive manner, Martinez continued. This bear showed no fear of humans and appeared to be actively hunting them rather than simply defending territory or cubs. The investigation revealed that the same bear had been involved in multiple previous encounters with humans in the Bear Lake area over the preceding 3 weeks. Trail cameras had captured images of the animal approaching occupied campsites, and there had been several reports of an unusually bold grizzly bear that failed to respond to standard deterrent measures like noisemakers and bear spray. This bear had clearly lost its natural fear of humans, explained park wildlife biologist Dr. Robert Thompson. Bears that become habituated to human presence pose an extreme danger to public safety and typically must be removed from the population through lethal control measures. The decision to euthanize the bear was not made lightly, but Martinez and her team concluded that the animal's aggressive behavior and lack of fear made it too dangerous to relocate or attempt to rehabilitate. A specialized hunting team tracked the bear for 5 days following the attack, finally locating it in a dense patch of oak brush approximately 2 miles from Bear Lake. The bear showed no fear when our team approached, reported lead hunter Tom Wilson, a veteran wildlife control specialist with 30 years of experience. It actually approached us aggressively, which confirmed our assessment that this animal had completely lost its natural wariness of humans. The bear was shot and killed on November 24th, 6 days after the attack. Necropsy results revealed that the animal was a 10-year-old male weighing 463 pounds, smaller than initial estimates, but still a formidable predator. More importantly, stomach contents analysis showed that the bear had been feeding extensively on human food waste, likely from improperly secured garbage and camping supplies. This case illustrates the critical importance of proper food storage and waste management in bear country, Martinez emphasized. When bears begin to associate humans with food sources, they lose their natural fear and can become extremely dangerous. David Wright spent 3 weeks in intensive care at Medical Center of the Rockies, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair the damage from the bear attack. His injuries included permanent nerve damage in his left arm, chronic pain from his chest and shoulder wounds, and severe psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to address. The physical injuries were actually the easier part to deal with, David later told investigators. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the constant anxiety, those are the things that really change your life. I can't be in the woods anymore without feeling like something is hunting me. Jessica's recovery was somewhat less complicated from a medical standpoint, but the psychological impact of the attack was equally severe. She developed acute post-traumatic stress disorder and was unable to return to work for nearly 6 months. Even simple activities like hiking local trails around Boulder became impossible due to panic attacks and overwhelming anxiety. People don't understand that surviving something like this doesn't mean you're okay. Jessica explained during a victim impact statement at a later legal proceeding. We survived physically, but we both lost something in those woods that we'll never get back. The people we were before November 18th, those people don't exist anymore. The legal ramifications of the attack were complex and played out over several years in both federal and state courts. Jessica and David filed suit against the National Park Service, alleging that park officials had failed to adequately warn visitors about the dangerous bear, despite multiple previous encounters. The lawsuit claimed that the Park Service should have closed the Bear Lake Trail or taken other measures to protect public safety. The Park Service had clear knowledge that this particular bear was behaving aggressively and posed a threat to human safety, argued plaintiff's attorney Robert Klein. Multiple witnesses had reported unusual bear behavior in the area, and the agency failed to take appropriate action to protect visitors. The federal government disputed these claims, arguing that the Park Service had provided adequate warnings through posted signs and that the victims had assumed the inherent risks of backcountry recreation. Government attorneys pointed out that both Jessica and David were experienced hikers who were aware of bear safety protocols and had chosen to proceed despite visible warnings. Tragic as this incident was, it represents the kind of unavoidable risk that exists in wild places, argued Department of Justice Attorney Lisa Hayes. The Park Service cannot guarantee absolute safety in areas where humans and wildlife coexist, nor should visitors expect such guarantees when they choose to enter bear habitat. The case eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with both sides agreeing to enhanced bear safety measures in Rocky Mountain National Park. These measures included improved signage, mandatory bear safety education for backcountry permit holders, and increased wildlife monitoring in high-use areas. The attack also sparked broader discussions about grizzly bear management in Colorado and the greater Rocky Mountain region. Colorado's grizzly bear population had been considered extinct since the 1950s, but recent genetic evidence suggested that small numbers of the animals might be recolonizing suitable habitat from populations in Wyoming and Montana. This incident raises important questions about how we manage large carnivores in areas with high levels of human use, explained Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a wildlife biologist with the Colorado Division of Wildlife. As grizzly populations recover and potentially expand their range, we need to be prepared for more frequent human-bear encounters. The Bear Lake Trail remained closed for nearly 2 months following the attack, while wildlife officials ensured that no other dangerous bears were present in the area. When the trail reopened in late January 2026, it was with enhanced safety protocols, including mandatory bear spray for all hikers and increased ranger patrols during peak use periods. For Jessica and David, the reopening of the trail was largely irrelevant. Neither had any intention of returning to the place where their lives had changed so dramatically. Both had relocated away from Colorado by that point, seeking to distance themselves from the memories and triggers associated with their former home. Some people think we should go back there, face our fears, reclaim that place, David said during a rare interview 2 years after the attack. But that's not how trauma works. That place tried to kill us, and we have no obligation to make peace with it. We survived, and that's enough. The grizzly bear that attacked Jessica Allen and David Wright on November 18, 2025, was ultimately an anomaly, a wild animal whose behavior fell outside the normal parameters of species interaction with humans. But their 4-minute encounter in the Colorado wilderness served as a stark reminder that nature, for all its beauty and appeal, remains fundamentally indifferent to human life and human plans. The case became required reading in wilderness medicine courses and bear safety programs across North America, serving as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters. But for the 2 people who lived through those terrifying minutes above Bear Lake, it remained not a case study or teaching tool, but simply the worst day of their lives, a day that divided their existence into before and after, forever changing their relationship with the wild places they had once loved. In the end, the November 18th attack served as a brutal reminder that in bear country, humans are not at the top of the food chain, and that 4 minutes is more than enough time for nature to demonstrate who truly belongs in the wilderness and who is merely visiting on borrowed time. The next stories, the Larsen Bay incident. Pastor William Bill Harris had always believed that God's voice could be heard most clearly in the wilderness. That belief would cost him everything on a crisp February morning in 2025, when the boundaries between civilization and the wild collapsed in a matter of minutes. The Kodiak Community Church had been planning their annual winter retreat for months. Bill, a robust man of 52 with weathered hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had chosen a remote clearing 3 miles inland from Larsen Bay. The location offered breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks and stood near an old trapper's cabin that could serve as shelter if needed. "There's something powerful about worshipping where the earth meets the sky," Bill had told his wife Martha just days before. She'd stayed home with their youngest daughter Emma, who'd come down with flu, a decision that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The congregation that gathered that Sunday morning numbered 23 souls, ranging from teenagers to elderly members who'd insisted on making the trek despite family concerns. Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old wildlife photographer and relatively new church member, had volunteered to document the service. Her camera would later provide crucial evidence for investigators. Dr. Robert Jameson, a retired physician in his 70s, had brought his medical bag despite protests from his daughter. "Old habits," he'd chuckled, adjusting his thick wool coat. Beside him stood Jennifer Martinez, a single mother of 2 who cleaned the church twice weekly and never missed a service. Her teenage son Marcus had convinced his girlfriend Ashley Brooks to join them, both awkward in their winter gear but eager for an adventure. The Kowalski family had driven up from Kodiak Town, Tom, a commercial fisherman, his wife Linda, and their twin 8-year-old boys, Jake and Luke. The twins had been bubbling with excitement about seeing bears, not understanding the cruel irony that would soon unfold. Elder Patricia Northwood, 84 and sharp as winter air, led the opening hymn with her strong voice carrying across the clearing. Standing near her were the Hendersons, Gary, a bush pilot, and his wife Brenda, both in their 40s and experienced outdoors people. They'd brought camping chairs and a portable heater, prepared for comfort in the wilderness. Young David Reeves, fresh out of seminary at 25, served as Bill's assistant pastor. He'd been nervous about the outdoor service, constantly checking his watch and scanning the tree line. His girlfriend, nurse practitioner Kelly Thornton, had teased him about his anxiety just that morning. The Miller brothers, Carl and Pete, both in their 30s and avid hunters, had positioned themselves at the edges of the group. They knew these woods and carried rifles, though they'd left them at the vehicles per Bill's request for a peaceful gathering. As the service began at 10 a.m., none of them noticed the massive form watching from the dense spruce forest 200 yards away. The bear was a mature male Kodiak, weighing nearly 1,200 pounds, a giant even by the standards of his species. Scarred from territorial battles and driven by the desperate hunger of a late winter, he'd been tracking human scent for hours. Bill's voice rang out across the clearing as he began his sermon about facing fears with faith. "When we step into God's creation," he proclaimed, his breath visible in the cold air, "we surrender our illusions of control. We trust in something greater than ourselves." Sarah clicked photos throughout the service, capturing moments of reverence and community against the stark beauty of the Alaskan wilderness. Through her telephoto lens, she noticed movement in the tree line, but dismissed it as wind stirring the branches. The timestamps on her camera would later become crucial evidence. 10:23 a.m. showed the congregation in peaceful worship. 10:24 a.m. captured the first glimpse of brown fur emerging from the forest. The bear had been watching, learning, waiting. Kodiaks are among the most intelligent of bears, capable of complex problem-solving and pattern recognition. This particular male had encountered humans before: garbage raids, fishing conflicts, territorial disputes. But he'd never seen them gathered in such numbers, seemingly vulnerable and unaware. Dr. Jameson was the first to sense something wrong. Decades of medical practice had honed his instincts for danger, and something in the quality of silence that had fallen over the forest set his nerves on edge. The normal sounds, birds, small mammals, wind through branches, had ceased entirely. It was a silence that spoke of a predator's presence. "Bill," he called softly, interrupting the pastor mid-sentence, "something's not right." That's when Gary Henderson, with his pilot's trained eyes, spotted the movement. "Bear," he said, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. 3 o'clock. Big one. The congregation's peaceful communion shattered in an instant. Heads turned, gasps arose, and the careful serenity of their wilderness worship dissolved into primitive fear. The bear had emerged fully from the tree line now, massive and dark against the snow-covered ground. Carl Miller cursed under his breath, calculating the distance to his rifle back at the truck. Too far, much too far. "Everyone stay calm," he called out, his hunting experience taking over. "Don't run. Make yourself look big. Back away, slowly." But the bear wasn't behaving like a typical defensive or curious animal. Its gait was purposeful, predatory. Its massive head swayed from side to side as it assessed the group, processing information with an intelligence that would haunt survivors' nightmares for years to come. Jennifer Martinez pulled her son Marcus close, her maternal instincts overriding every other concern. Ashley Brooks, the teenager visiting for the first time, began to hyperventilate. Kelly Thornton, the nurse, moved toward Ashley while David Reeves stood frozen, his seminary training having never prepared him for this moment. The Kowalski twins, Jake and Luke, stared in wide-eyed fascination until their mother Linda snatched them behind her, whispering fierce instructions to be quiet and still. Tom Kowalski, the fisherman, had faced storms at sea, but nothing like this land-based terror. Patricia Northwood, the elderly woman whose voice had led their hymns minutes before, surprised everyone by remaining remarkably calm. She'd lived through World War II, raised 6 children in harsh frontier conditions, and buried 2 husbands. A bear, even one this massive, would not break her composure. The bear paused 60 yards away, standing on its hind legs to get a better view. At full height, it towered nearly 10 feet tall, a mountain of muscle and predatory intelligence. Its small, dark eyes surveyed the group with an unsettling focus, as if cataloguing each individual for future reference. Sarah Chen, despite her terror, continued photographing. Her professional instincts overrode personal fear, and she documented the bear's approach with a steady hand that would later amaze investigators. Her photos showed the animal's scarred hide, its massive claws, and most disturbingly, the calculating intelligence in its expression. Bill Harris, even in this moment of crisis, tried to maintain his pastoral role. "Lord," he prayed aloud, "grant us wisdom and protection in this hour of need." His voice carried across the clearing, strong despite the fear evident in his trembling hands. The prayer seemed to trigger something in the bear. Perhaps it was the human voice, or the movement of the group, or some instinct beyond human understanding. Whatever the catalyst, the massive predator dropped to all fours and began moving toward them with increasing speed. "Run!" Gary Henderson shouted, abandoning all wilderness protocol in the face of obvious aggression. "Everyone to the trucks!" But the vehicles were 300 yards away through thick snow, and the bear could cover that distance in less than 30 seconds. Panic erupted as the congregation scattered, their careful winter formations dissolving into chaos. Dr. Jameson, despite his age, helped Patricia Northwood begin moving toward the vehicles. The elderly woman's cane sank deep into the snow with each step, progress agonizingly slow. Behind them, Jennifer Martinez and her son Marcus struggled through drifts that reached the teenager's waist. Carl and Pete Miller sprinted toward their truck and the rifles inside, but the bear had chosen its angle of attack with predatory intelligence. It moved to cut off the main escape route, forcing the group to scatter in different directions through the deep snow. Kelly Thornton reached Ashley Brooks just as the teenager collapsed in hyperventilation. "Breathe," she commanded, using her medical training to stay focused. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. We're going to get out of this." David Reeves, the young assistant pastor, found courage he didn't know he possessed. Instead of fleeing, he moved toward the bear, shouting and waving his arms to draw its attention away from the others. "Here, come this way." The bear's charge was terrifyingly swift. Despite weighing over half a ton, it moved through the snow with shocking agility. Sarah's camera captured the moment when playful curiosity transformed into lethal intent. The bear's ears flattened back, its massive shoulders bunched with muscle, its breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Pastor Bill Harris made a decision that would define his legacy. Instead of running, he positioned himself between the bear and his most vulnerable congregation members. "In the name of Jesus," he called out, standing firm as the massive predator approached, "I command you to stop." The bear struck him with one massive paw, the impact lifting the pastor off his feet and sending him crashing into a nearby snowbank. The sound, a wet, crushing impact followed by Bill's sharp cry, would echo in survivors' memories forever. But the pastor's sacrifice created precious seconds. Tom Kowalski had reached his truck and was frantically digging for flares in his emergency kit. Gary Henderson had made it to his vehicle and was laying on the horn, creating a cacophony of noise that momentarily confused the bear. Dr. Jameson had gotten Patricia Northwood close to the vehicles when he heard Bill's scream. Despite every instinct telling him to continue fleeing, the old physician turned back. His Hippocratic oath wouldn't let him abandon an injured man, not even with death stalking the clearing. The bear, having struck down the pastor, seemed momentarily uncertain. It sniffed at Bill's motionless form, then raised its head to assess the remaining threats. The noise from the vehicle horns and the scattered, panicking humans created sensory overload for the massive predator. Jennifer Martinez had nearly reached the tree line with Marcus when she stumbled, her ankle twisting in the deep snow. Her son tried to help her up, but she pushed him away. "Run, mijo!" she screamed. "Don't look back!" Marcus Martinez, 17 years old and terrified beyond comprehension, made the hardest decision of his young life. He left his mother and sprinted toward the vehicles, tears freezing on his cheeks as he heard her cries behind him. Carl Miller had reached his truck and was loading his rifle with shaking hands. His brother Pete was doing the same, both men fighting against cold-numbed fingers and pure adrenaline. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the bear would turn its attention to new targets. Ashley Brooks, with Kelly Thornton's help, had gotten her breathing under control and was moving toward the vehicles. The teenager kept looking back at the chaos behind them, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. This wasn't how Sunday morning was supposed to go. This wasn't how anything was supposed to go. The Kowalski twins, Jake and Luke, were crying now as their parents carried them through the snow. Linda Kowalski whispered prayers and reassurances, but her voice shook with terror. Tom had gotten his flare gun loaded and fired a bright red flare over the clearing, hoping the noise and light might drive the bear away. The bear's attention turned to Dr. Jameson as the elderly physician approached the fallen pastor. Perhaps it was movement or the man's determined approach, but the massive predator began moving toward this new target with renewed purpose. "Robert, no!" Patricia Northwood called out. But the old doctor had made his choice. At 73, he'd lived a full life. Bill Harris still had years ahead of him, a family waiting at home, a congregation that needed him. Dr. Jameson reached Bill just as the bear closed distance. The pastor was conscious but badly injured. His left arm bent at an impossible angle, blood staining the snow around him. "Can you move?" the doctor asked urgently. "The others," Bill gasped. "Save the others." The bear struck Dr. Jameson from behind, massive jaws clamping down on the elderly man's torso. His scream cut through the winter air, a sound of agony that would haunt every survivor. But even as he died, his sacrifice bought precious time for others to reach safety. Carl Miller's first shot echoed across the clearing, the bullet striking a tree just feet from the bear. The noise and impact caused the massive predator to release Dr. Jameson's body and turn toward this new threat. Pete Miller fired next, his shot also missing but creating another thunderous crack that further disoriented the animal. Jennifer Martinez, struggling with her injured ankle, had made it to a cluster of large boulders near the tree line. She pressed herself against the cold stone, trying to become invisible as the bear's attention swept the clearing. Her son Marcus had reached the vehicles and was screaming for her to run, but she couldn't move fast enough. Gary Henderson had gotten his truck started and was driving it toward the clearing, using the vehicle as both weapon and shield. His horn blared continuously as he tried to position himself between the bear and the remaining congregation members. Brenda Henderson was in the passenger seat calling 911 on her satellite phone, though help was hours away in this remote location. The bear, now facing threats from multiple directions, began showing signs of confusion and agitation. The noise from vehicles, gunshots, and human screams created chaos that even its intelligence couldn't easily process. It swayed between targets, unsure whether to continue attacking or retreat. Kelly Thornton had gotten Ashley Brooks to Carl Miller's truck and was pushing the teenager inside when she heard Jennifer Martinez calling for help. As a medical professional, leaving an injured person behind went against every instinct she possessed. "Stay here," she told Ashley firmly, then turned back toward the clearing where Jennifer was trapped near the rocks. David Reeves, the young assistant pastor, saw where she was going and followed despite his terror. Pastor Bill Harris, despite his injuries, was trying to crawl toward Dr. Jameson's motionless form. Blood loss was making him dizzy, and his broken arm sent waves of agony through his body with every movement. But Bob Jameson had died trying to save him. The least Bill could do was check if there was any life left to save. The bear, overwhelmed by the chaos, made a decision that probably saved lives. Instead of continuing to attack, it began moving back toward the tree line. But it moved slowly, pausing frequently to look back at the humans, as if memorizing their scents and faces for future encounters. Tom Kowalski had reached his wife and children, bundling them into their vehicle, while Linda continued praying in Spanish, her voice barely audible over the surrounding pandemonium. The twins were clinging to their parents, no longer fascinated by the prospect of seeing bears. Patricia Northwood, the elderly woman who'd lived through so much, had made it to Gary Henderson's truck. She sat in the cab, perfectly composed, watching the scene unfold with the detached observation of someone who'd seen too much tragedy to be completely broken by more. Carl Miller's third shot was more accurate, striking the ground just in front of the retreating bear. The impact sent up a spray of snow and dirt that finally convinced the massive predator to abandon its assault. It turned and began moving with more urgency toward the forest. Kelly Thornton and David Reeves reached Jennifer Martinez as the bear disappeared into the tree line. Jennifer was conscious but in severe pain, her ankle clearly broken and possibly sprained. "Marcus," she gasped. "Is Marcus safe?" "He's safe," Kelly assured her, beginning a quick medical assessment. "We're going to get you out of here." But the clearing was far from secure. The bear had retreated but not fled entirely. Its massive form was still visible among the trees, watching, waiting, perhaps planning another approach. Carl and Pete Miller kept their rifles trained on the forest, knowing that wounded bears were often more dangerous than healthy ones. Gary Henderson maneuvered his truck closer to where Bill Harris lay bleeding in the snow. The pastor was still conscious, but growing weaker, his face pale with shock and blood loss. Getting him to medical care quickly would mean the difference between survival and joining Dr. Jameson in death. "We need to evacuate," Pete Miller called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Now, before it comes back." The retreat was organized chaos. Bill Harris was carefully loaded into Gary Henderson's truck bed, despite the risk of moving someone with unknown internal injuries. Speed was more important than perfect medical protocol when a 1,200-pound predator might return at any moment. Dr. Jameson's body lay motionless in the blood-stained snow. Leaving him behind violated every human instinct, but the bear was still in the area and the living needed immediate evacuation. His sacrifice would be remembered, his body recovered later when law enforcement arrived with proper support. Jennifer Martinez was helped into Carl Miller's truck, her son Marcus crying with relief as he held his mother's hand. Ashley Brooks, the visiting teenager, sat in shocked silence, staring at the forest where the bear had disappeared. As the vehicles began moving toward the main road, Sarah Chen realized she was still clutching her camera. In her terror and adrenaline, she'd continued photographing almost unconsciously. The memory cards in her camera held a photographic record of everything. The peaceful service, the bear's approach, the attacks, the aftermath. The convoy of vehicles moved as quickly as conditions allowed over the rough logging road that led to Larsen Bay. Bill Harris drifted in and out of consciousness in the truck bed, Patricia Northwood holding pressure on his worst wounds, while Gary Henderson navigated carefully to avoid jostling his injured passenger. Behind them, the clearing fell silent except for wind through the trees and the occasional call of ravens gathering around Dr. Jameson's body. The bear had retreated deeper into the forest, but remained in the area, a massive presence that would make recovery operations dangerous for days to come. As they reached cellular range, Brenda Henderson's 911 call finally connected. Her voice shook as she reported the attack to Alaska State Troopers, requesting immediate medical evacuation and bear management response. The dispatcher, experienced with wilderness emergencies, began coordinating a response that would involve multiple agencies. Life Flight Alaska received the call at 11:47 a.m., less than 2 hours after the attack began. The helicopter crew began immediate preparation for a medevac mission to the remote Kodiak Island location, knowing they'd be flying into potentially active bear territory. Alaska Department of Fish and Game Bear biologist Dr. Sandra Whitfield was contacted at home, interrupted from her Sunday morning coffee, by news of a Kodiak bear attack with multiple casualties. Her expertise would be crucial in determining whether the bear posed an ongoing public threat and how to safely recover the remaining victim. The convoy reached Larsen Bay's small airstrip at 12:15 p.m. Bill Harris was still alive, but barely conscious, his vital signs weak but stable. The nearest hospital was in Kodiak, 30 minutes by air if weather permitted the flight. Life flight arrived at 12:43 p.m., landing in a swirl of snow and rotor wash. The paramedic crew immediately began advanced life support on Bill Harris while assessing Jennifer Martinez's injuries. Both patients would need immediate evacuation to Kodiak Regional Hospital. As the helicopter lifted off with the most seriously injured, Alaska State Troopers were already en route by boat and aircraft. Senior Trooper Michael Richardson would lead the investigation, working with fish and game officials to determine what had triggered such an aggressive attack from a species normally wary of humans. The surviving congregation members waited at Larsen Bay's community center, drinking coffee from paper cups and trying to process what they'd witnessed. Marcus Martinez sat beside his girlfriend Ashley Brooks, both teenagers aged decades in the span of 2 hours. Kelly Thornton, using her medical training, helped treat minor injuries and shock among the survivors. Everyone had cuts, bruises, and frostbite from their desperate flight through deep snow, but the psychological wounds would prove more lasting than physical ones. Sarah Chen uploaded her photographs to her laptop, creating a digital record before authorities could request the memory cards as evidence. The images told a story of transformation, from peaceful worship to primal terror in less than 4 minutes of real time. Carl and Pete Miller cleaned their rifles methodically, their hunting experience helping them process the morning's events. They'd fired to save lives, not take them, but the responsibility weighed heavily. Neither had wanted to kill the bear, only drive it away from the congregation. Patricia Northwood, the elderly woman whose composure had remained unbroken, finally allowed herself a moment of grief for Dr. Robert Jameson. They'd known each other for 40 years, served on church committees together, shared countless conversations about faith and mortality. By evening, news of the attack had reached media outlets across Alaska and beyond. Kodiak Bear Attacks Church Service became the leading story on local news, with reporters scrambling to reach Larsen Bay for interviews with survivors. The bear remained at large, its behavior patterns now catalogued by experts as unusually aggressive. Dr. Whitfield arrived by charter flight that afternoon, beginning an investigation that would reveal disturbing changes in local bear behavior linked to climate disruption and human encroachment. At Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center, Bill Harris underwent emergency surgery for internal injuries, broken ribs, and severe lacerations. Dr. Maria Santos, the trauma surgeon, worked for 6 hours to repair damage from the bear's massive paw strike. Jennifer Martinez required surgery on her ankle, but was stable and conscious, asking constantly about her son Marcus. The teenager had suffered no physical injuries, but showed signs of severe emotional trauma, jumping at sudden noises and unable to stop replaying his mother's fall in the snow. The body recovery operation began the following morning, with state troopers and fish and game officials working together to safely retrieve Dr. Jameson's remains. The bear had been tracked to a den site 2 miles from the attack location, but showed no signs of leaving the territory. Wildlife officials made the difficult decision to euthanize the bear after determining it posed an ongoing public safety threat. The massive male was found to be suffering from an infected wound and possible neurological damage that may have contributed to its aggressive behavior. Pastor Bill Harris survived his injuries but required months of physical therapy and multiple reconstructive surgeries. His left arm never regained full function, but he returned to ministry with a deeper understanding of mortality and the thin line between civilization and wilderness. The Kodiak Community Church established the Dr. Robert Jameson Memorial Fund, honoring the physician who died trying to save others. The fund supports wilderness safety education and medical training for remote communities across Alaska. Sarah Chen's photographs became crucial evidence in the investigation and were later displayed in a museum exhibition about human-wildlife conflict in Alaska. Her images captured not just the violence, but the humanity. People risking their lives for others, faith tested by ultimate fear, community bonds forged in crisis. The teenagers, Marcus Martinez and Ashley Brooks, both required extensive counseling to process their trauma. Marcus struggled with guilt about leaving his mother behind, while Ashley developed severe anxiety about outdoor spaces. Both eventually recovered but carried invisible scars from that February morning. The attack prompted changes in Alaska's Wilderness Church Service guidelines, requiring bear safety protocols and communication equipment for any outdoor religious gatherings. Bill Harris supported these measures, knowing that faith and wisdom weren't mutually exclusive. 3 years later, the Kodiak Community Church still holds an annual memorial service for Dr. Robert Jameson, though safely within their sanctuary walls. The wilderness clearing where it all happened remains empty, marked only by a small memorial stone placed by the surviving congregation members. The official investigation concluded that the bear had been driven to unusual aggression by injury, illness, and environmental pressures. Climate change was altering traditional food sources, forcing bears into more frequent contact with humans, and creating tensions that sometimes exploded into violence. Jennifer Martinez made a full physical recovery, but moved her family to Anchorage, unable to remain in an area where she'd nearly died. She still attended church, but never again participated in outdoor services, preferring the security of walls and doors between her and the wilderness. Patricia Northwood continued attending services until her death at age 87, often speaking about that terrible morning as a test of faith that revealed both human frailty and divine protection. She never again complained about minor inconveniences, having witnessed true catastrophe. Kelly Thornton and David Reeves married 2 years after the attack, their shared trauma and mutual support during the crisis having deepened their relationship. They moved to a church in Fairbanks, where David's ministry focused on helping trauma survivors find healing through faith. Gary and Brenda Henderson continued their bush pilot service, but added emergency medical training to their qualifications. They'd learned that survival in Alaska required preparation for any catastrophe, from mechanical failure to wildlife encounters. The Miller brothers, Carl and Pete, became volunteer wilderness safety instructors, teaching bear awareness and survival skills throughout the region. Their experience that day had taught them that even experienced outdoorsmen could be caught unprepared for nature's sudden violence. Tom and Linda Kowalski moved their family to the lower 48 states, unable to raise their children in a place where Sunday morning worship could become a life-or-death struggle. The twins, Jake and Luke, grew up with therapy and careful attention to their emotional development. The Larsen Bay incident, as it became known in wildlife management circles, changed protocols for bear management across Alaska. The attack demonstrated that even normally predictable wildlife could become dangerously unpredictable under stress, injury, or environmental pressure. Dr. Sandra Whitfield's investigation revealed that the attacking bear had been injured in a territorial fight weeks earlier with infected wounds that likely caused constant pain and behavioral changes. The bear's aggression wasn't random violence, but the response of a suffering animal driven beyond normal behavioral limits. The clearing where the attack occurred gradually returned to wilderness, snow covering the bloodstains and time healing the scars on the land, if not on human memory. Wildlife cameras showed that other bears used the area regularly, drawn by berry bushes and stream access. Years later, Sarah Chen returned to the clearing alone, camera in hand, seeking closure through photography. The images she captured that day showed peace and natural beauty, but she could still see in her mind's eye the terror that had unfolded there on one February morning. The Kodiak Community Church eventually built a small chapel in town, a compromise between Bill Harris's love of wilderness worship and the congregation's need for security. The chapel's large windows offered views of mountains and forest while keeping the wild at a safe distance. Bill Harris retired from active ministry 5 years after the attack, but continued counseling trauma survivors and teaching wilderness safety. His damaged left arm served as a constant reminder that faith without wisdom could be dangerous, that trusting God didn't require ignoring practical precautions. The incident prompted changes in Alaska's emergency response protocols for remote areas, improving coordination between multiple agencies and reducing response times for wilderness medical emergencies. Dr. Jameson's death had not been in vain if it prevented others. Mental health resources for trauma survivors expanded across rural Alaska following the attack, with particular attention to helping isolated communities process collective trauma. The Larsen Bay incident had shown that entire communities could be affected by single catastrophic events. Ashley Brooks, the visiting teenager who'd experienced her first and last wilderness church service, became a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. Her personal experience with sudden terror and its aftermath guided her professional work helping other survivors. The memorial stone placed at the attack site bears a simple inscription: Dr. Robert Jameson. He gave his life trying to save another. Visitors occasionally leave flowers, creating small splashes of color against the wilderness backdrop. Weather patterns and climate data from the attack date showed unusual conditions that may have contributed to wildlife stress. The winter had been warmer and wetter than normal, disrupting hibernation patterns and food availability for bears emerging early from dens. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game incorporated lessons from the Larsen Bay incident into their bear management policies, emphasizing that injured or stressed bears could exhibit behavior completely outside normal parameters. Traditional wisdom about bear avoidance didn't always apply to animals suffering from pain or neurological damage. Church safety protocols across Alaska were revised following the incident, with requirements for communication equipment, evacuation plans, and wildlife awareness training for any outdoor religious gatherings. Faith communities learned to balance spiritual needs with practical safety concerns. The helicopter crew that evacuated Bill Harris and Jennifer Martinez received commendations for their rapid response and professional excellence under difficult conditions. Flying into potential bear territory to help attack victims required courage beyond normal medical evacuation duties. Local search and rescue volunteers who assisted in the body recovery operation and survivor support received additional training in wildlife encounter protocols. The incident had shown that even experienced rescuers could be unprepared for the complexities of wildlife attack responses. Media coverage of the attack evolved from sensational headlines to thoughtful examination of human-wildlife conflict in a changing climate. The story became a case study in responsible reporting about wildlife incidents, avoiding sensationalism while addressing serious safety issues. The surviving congregation members gathered annually on the attack anniversary, not at the site, but in the safety of their church sanctuary. They shared memories of Dr. Jameson's sacrifice and Pastor Harris's courage, finding meaning in tragedy through community and shared faith. Educational materials developed from the incident reached schools across Alaska, teaching children about wildlife safety and the importance of respecting natural boundaries. The story served as a powerful lesson in wilderness awareness for young Alaskans. Research conducted on the attacking bear's remains revealed insights into the effects of environmental stress on wildlife behavior. The bear's brain showed signs of chronic pain response that likely altered normal behavioral patterns, contributing to its unusual aggression toward humans. The Larsen Bay Community Center, where survivors gathered after the attack, became a model for rural emergency response facilities. Improvements in communication equipment, medical supplies, and trauma support resources helped prepare for future wilderness emergencies. Legal proceedings following the incident focused on liability and insurance issues rather than criminal charges. No one was found at fault for the attack, which was determined to be an unforeseeable wildlife encounter despite occurring in known bear territory. The Alaska State Troopers investigation report became required reading for wilderness law enforcement training programs. The incident demonstrated the complexity of managing crime scenes in remote areas with ongoing wildlife threats and multiple agency coordination needs. Environmental scientists studying the incident's background found correlations between changing salmon runs, berry crop failures, and increased bear-human encounters. The attack occurred against a backdrop of ecosystem disruption that forced wildlife into unusual behaviors and locations. Tourism safety protocols for Kodiak Island were enhanced following the incident, with stricter requirements for guides, better emergency communication systems, and improved coordination with wildlife management authorities. The island's reputation as a bear viewing destination required balancing visitor access with safety concerns. The story of the Larsen Bay incident was eventually adapted into a documentary film focusing on wilderness safety and community resilience rather than sensationalizing the violence. Survivors participated in the project to ensure accurate representation of their experience and its aftermath. Years after the attack, Bill Harris would often stand at his chapel's large windows looking out at the wilderness he still loved, despite everything. He'd learned that respecting nature meant understanding its capacity for both beauty and sudden violence. Finding faith not in denying danger, but in facing it with wisdom and preparation. The clearing where it all began remains unchanged, a testament to nature's indifference to human tragedy and resilience. Seasons pass, snow falls and melts, and life continues in patterns far older than human memory, occasionally intersecting with human lives in ways that change everything in moments.